need to write this down properly, for once, instead of in the fragments I've been giving people for the last year. My editor got a version. The police got a version. My wife got a version eventually, though not the full one, because some of it I haven't told her and I'm not sure I ever will. Each version was shaped by who I was telling it to, which is what journalists do, I suppose, even when the story is about themselves. So this is me trying to do it without the shaping. I'll probably fail. I'll probably still shape it, but I'm going to try. My name's Dave. I'm 41. I've worked for a regional news group covering the Midlands for about 15 years. Started on a weekly in Tamworth, moved through a couple of titles, ended up doing longer form investigative pieces for a digital outfit that covers the wider region, Birmingham out to Stoke, down to Coventry, the whole unglamorous sprawl of it. I like it here, for what it's worth. People assume you'd want to get out, get to London, get to the Nationals, and some people do, and good luck to them. I never wanted that. There's enough going on round here if you look properly, and most people don't look properly, which is sort of the point of what I do. I live in Tamworth still, with my wife Joanne and our 2 kids, in a 3-bed semi on an estate that's almost identical to about 4 other estates within a mile of it. Joanne works part-time for the council, does something with housing benefit admin that she's better at explaining than I am. The kids are 8 and 11. It's an ordinary life. I want to say that clearly because what happened doesn't fit with an ordinary life. And I think that's part of why it happened, because I wasn't expecting anything to not fit. The story I was working on, and this is where I have to be honest about something I haven't been honest about in the other versions, started as something fairly small. There'd been 2 incidents in the space of about 6 months, both in towns within my patch, both involving teenage girls who'd gone missing for short periods, a day, 2 days, and turned up safe, but wouldn't say where they'd been or who they'd been with. Both families had separately mentioned to local contacts that the girls had been using an app, the same app, and that something on the app had unsettled them before they'd gone. Nothing that amounted to a crime, as far as the police were concerned. No charges. Just 2 families with the same uneasy feeling about the same piece of software, in towns about 20 miles apart, within the same 6 months. That's the kind of thing that's a story, not a big story. A local app, local concern. Here's what parents should know kind of story. The sort of thing I'd done dozens of times. I want to be honest. Part of why I pursued it was that it was an easy week. I'd had a run of heavier stuff, a piece on hospital waiting times that had taken about 3 weeks, and a lot of FOI requests, and had landed with roughly the impact of a wet towel. And this felt like something I could turn around quickly. Download the app, have a look, talk to the families, talk to a child safety charity, write 800 words, move on. That's not a noble motivation, and I'm including it because the other versions of this I've given people make it sound like I went looking for something dark out of some sense of mission. I didn't. I went looking for an easy week. The app itself was nothing remarkable. One of those anonymous social platforms aimed at teenagers. You could post without your name attached. People could respond. The whole thing built around the appeal of saying things you wouldn't say with your name on it. There'd been a wave of these apps over the years, most of them eventually associated with bullying concerns, and most of them eventually fading out when the next one came along. This one was called something forgettable, the kind of name that's 3 syllables and means nothing, and it had a user base concentrated in the Midlands for reasons that weren't obvious. Sometimes these things just take off regionally before anyone can explain why. I made an account, gave a fake age, 16, which is standard practice for this kind of thing. You can't research how teenagers experience an app by experiencing it as a 41-year-old. I spent a few evenings on it, mostly seeing what you'd expect. The ordinary churn of teenage anonymous posting, complaints about school, relationship stuff, some bullying that was unpleasant, but not unusual, the kind of thing the 800-word piece could reasonably gesture at. And then there was a feature I hadn't initially understood, which was a kind of matching system. The app would periodically suggest connections between users based on activity, ostensibly to help people find others with similar interests. I got matched with an account called something like Wanderer_92. And out of the diligence that I'd like to claim was journalistic instinct, but was probably just boredom, I engaged with it. The conversation was unremarkable for a while. Whoever was behind the account, and I want to flag now because it matters later, that I had no idea at this point who or what I was actually talking to. Presented as an older teenager, 17 or 18, a bit world-weary, the kind of persona that's extremely common on these platforms and which I'd seen 100 times. We talked about nothing much. I was doing what I'd describe as light touch engagement, enough to seem like a real user, not enough to actually build a relationship, because I wasn't there to build relationships. I was there to get a feel for the platform. After about 4 days, Wanderer_92 sent me a link. I'm going to stop here for a second, because this is the point where I have to talk about something that doesn't fit neatly into the rest of the account, and I've gone back and forth about whether to include it, and I'm including it because leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty. The link wasn't to anything on the app. It went outside, to a site I didn't recognize, with an address that didn't resolve to anything through normal means. I want to be honest about my reaction to receiving it, because my reaction was not caution. My reaction was the reaction of someone who just found the actual story. Here was a teenage user, or an account presenting as one, directing other users, presumably other teenagers, to something off-platform. That's not a "here's what parents should know" story anymore. That's a proper story. That's the kind of thing that gets you a follow-up commission, maybe a series, maybe. And I'm ashamed of how much this mattered to me at the time. Maybe some recognition beyond the regional patch I'd been working for 15 years. I clicked the link. Continued below. I'm not skipping this. I just need to say something first. Actually, I need to back up. I keep writing this in order, like it happened in order, like one thing led cleanly to the next, and that's not how it felt at the time, and I don't think it's honest to write it that way. What actually happened is that I clicked the link and the site loaded slowly, in the way that sites on parts of the internet that aren't meant to be easily found tend to load, piece by piece, and while it was loading I got up and made a cup of tea, because that's what you do. You don't sit and stare at a loading screen. And I came back with the tea and the site had finished loading, and I sat back down and I looked at it for, I don't actually know how long. That's the bit I can't reconstruct properly. There's a gap in my memory of that evening that I've never been able to fill in, between sitting down with the tea and the next thing I clearly remember, which is being sick in the bathroom. I've talked to a therapist about this gap since. She says it's not unusual, that the brain sometimes doesn't lay down memory properly when something overwhelms it, that there can be a kind of skip. I believe her. It doesn't make the skip less unsettling. I know what I saw, in the sense that I know the category of thing it was, but I don't have continuous memory of seeing it, and I've found that strange detachment, knowing something happened to me without being able to access the experience of it happening, almost as disturbing as the content itself would have been if I could remember it properly. What I can tell you, because the police later confirmed it, independently of my own memory, is that the site was a streaming platform, live and archived. The content was real harm to real people, and the platform was used by a community that discussed and rated and requested this content, with the casual interest of people discussing anything else they followed regularly. I know this because I've since read the police summary of what was on my laptop's cache from that evening, written in the careful, neutral language that these summaries use, and reading that summary was its own experience, separate from whatever happened in the gap. What was on the screen, specifically, when I sat down with my tea, I genuinely do not know. I don't know if there was an active stream. I don't know what I saw in the moments before whatever happened in my head happened. I know I was sick. I know that afterwards I closed the laptop and didn't open it again that night, and that I sat in the kitchen until about 4 in the morning, and that I didn't wake Joanne, and that in the morning I told her I had a stomach bug and went to work as normal, because I genuinely did not know that first morning what to do with what had happened. Here's the part I haven't told anyone in full, and I'm including it because it's the center of why I'm writing this at all. I didn't go to the police that day, or the next day. It took 6 days. 6 days in which I went to work, did my job, came home, sat with my family, and didn't say anything. 6 days in which I told myself a series of things that I now recognize as a person trying to manage something too large to process. That I needed to be sure of what I'd seen before reporting it. That I needed to check the site again to confirm it was what I thought it was. I didn't. I want to be clear. I never went back, but I told myself I might need to. That I needed to think about how this affected the original story, the app, the missing girls. Whether this was connected or a separate thing entirely that I'd stumbled into through bad luck. All of that was true, in the sense that those were genuinely the thoughts going through my head. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that I was frightened and ashamed in a way I couldn't articulate even to myself. And the 6 days were 6 days of a person walking around inside their own ordinary life, making the kids packed lunches, going to the school's autumn fair, sitting through a parents' evening, while carrying something that didn't belong anywhere inside that life and didn't have a place to be put down. On the 6th day, Joanne asked me what was wrong. Just that, directly, at the kitchen table, after the kids had gone to bed, and I told her, not everything. I didn't tell her about the gap, about the bathroom, not then, but I told her enough. And she was the one who said we needed to ring someone. And I think if she hadn't said that, I genuinely don't know how much longer the 6 days would have become. The investigation that followed was extensive, and parts of it I'm not able to discuss because of ongoing proceedings, and parts of it I've chosen not to ask about because I've learned. The way Joanne learned things about her own family history years ago, that she's told me she wishes she hadn't asked about, that not every question needs an answer. What I can say is that the app and the account and the link were part of something larger than 2 missing girls in 2 Midlands towns. The original story, the small, easy story I'd gone looking for, was real, but it was a thread hanging off something much bigger. A recruitment mechanism is the phrase that was used to me once, and which I've never been able to stop hearing in my head since. Teenagers on an anonymous platform, identified through their activity, approached through the matching feature, gradually drawn toward content and contacts that existed entirely outside any system designed to protect them. I was an adult posing as a teenager, and I got matched and approached within 4 days. I think about what that means for an actual teenager using that app, who wouldn't have my professional wariness, who wouldn't have spent 15 years developing the specific suspicion that comes from doing this job. I think about the 2 girls from the original story, who I never identified by name and never will, and what those missing days might actually have involved, and whether what happened to me in 4 days happened to them too, faster, because they were what the system was actually built to find. I didn't write the story. There's no 800 words, no follow-up series, none of the things I was thinking about in that first rush of excitement when Wanderer_92 sent the link. What I'm writing now isn't for the news group. It's this, whatever this is, an account for a different kind of audience, which feels like the right place for it in a way I can't fully explain. Except that this format doesn't ask me to have a conclusion, doesn't ask me to have found something out that other people need to know in order to be safe. It just asks me to say what happened. I still work the same patch. I still cover the unglamorous sprawl, Tamworth to Stoke, the stories that don't make the nationals. I'm more careful now about what I follow online, in a way that I think has made me a slightly worse journalist, more cautious, slower to chase things. And I've decided that's a trade I'm willing to make, because I know what's on the other side of not being cautious, even if I can't fully remember it. The gap is still there. The therapist says it might always be there, that some memories settle eventually, and some don't, and that the not knowing might be something I carry, rather than resolve. I've made a kind of peace with that, on the days when peace is available. On the other days, I think about the 4 days it took an adult with 15 years of professional wariness to get matched with something that shouldn't exist. And I think about how many days it takes for someone who doesn't have that wariness, and I don't have an answer, and I don't think there is one. Not a clean one, not one that fits in 800 words. That's what I was looking for, an easy week. I found something else, and I still don't fully know what it was, and I'm not sure that not knowing is the worst part, but some days it feels like it might be. I've tried writing this so many times I've lost count. Every time, I get a few paragraphs in before I close the laptop and tell myself I'll do it later, when I have the right words, when it doesn't feel like I'm tearing something open inside my chest. But there are no right words, and honestly, I remember everything too well. That's the problem. My brain won't let me forget a single detail. Every conversation, every decision, every moment I chose to keep going when I should have stopped. It's all there, sharp and clear, like it happened yesterday. I'm not writing this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm not asking you to understand. I already know what people will say, that I was broke, desperate, scared. Sure, that's all true, but that's not why I kept doing it. That's the easy explanation, the one that lets me off the hook. The real reason is harder to say out loud, because it means admitting I could turn off parts of myself I didn't know could be switched off, that I could compartmentalize my behavior to a degree that still unsettles me, even now, even after everything. 18 months ago, my life was ordinary, boring even, the kind of boring that other people probably envied. I worked at a marketing agency in Manchester, one of those mid-sized firms that handles accounts nobody's ever heard of, but that somehow keep the lights on. I split rent on the flat with my girlfriend Sarah and convinced myself this was what being an adult looked like. Wake up, go to work, come home, watch something on Netflix, repeat. The job wasn't exciting, but it paid on time, every time. I'd learned to measure happiness by how predictable things were, how stable. Excitement was for people who hadn't yet realized that stability was the real prize. Sarah and I had been together long enough that our routines had merged. We knew each other's schedules, split the bills without arguing about it, had our spots on the sofa. It wasn't passionate anymore, but I told myself that was normal. That passion was just the opening act, and what we had was the sustainable version, the real thing. Looking back, I wonder wonder if I was already trying to convince myself of things I didn't quite believe. The redundancy meeting was surreal in how scripted it felt. I was called in on a Wednesday afternoon, and the moment I saw my manager sitting with someone from HR, I knew. Everyone in that room had already processed what was about to happen to me. They'd had their meetings, made their decisions, prepared their talking points. The company was downsizing. My role was non-essential. Budget cuts, market conditions. They thanked me for my contributions, said they appreciated my work, handed me a folder explaining my final pay and notice period. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. I nodded through the whole thing, not because I agreed, but because my brain couldn't catch up. There was this weird disconnect between what I was hearing and what I was processing, like watching something happen to someone else. I even said thank you as I left the room. Thank you. For what? For destroying the stability I'd built my entire identity around. At first, unemployment felt temporary. I treated it like a gap between jobs rather than an ending. I updated my CV, spent hours tweaking the wording, sent out applications. I told Sarah not to worry. Something would come up quickly. Manchester was full of agencies. I had experience, good references. There was no reason to think I'd struggle as much as I eventually did. Except I did. Weeks turned into months. The interviews I did get never led anywhere. I'd spend days preparing, researching the company, practicing answers. And then I'd sit in reception, waiting rooms, feeling my confidence drain away before anyone even spoke to me. The rejections came in waves, all saying the same thing in slightly different language. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your experience doesn't quite match what we're looking for. We had a very strong field of applicants. The structure of my days began to collapse. I started waking up later because there was no reason to get up early. I'd make coffee and check my email obsessively, refreshing every few minutes even though I already knew nothing would be there. The flat became smaller somehow, the walls closer. I'd spend hours online scrolling through job sites, telling myself I was being productive when really I was just avoiding the growing panic. Sarah tried to be supportive at first. She'd ask how the job search was going in this carefully neutral tone, like she was afraid of setting me off. She'd tell me something would come up, that I just had to keep trying. But there's a difference between patience and faith, and I could feel the latter calcifying into something harder. She stopped talking about the future, holidays we might take, places we might move to, started focusing on immediate costs instead. Did we really need Netflix and Spotify? Should we switch to a cheaper phone plan? Could we cut back on takeaways? She never directly accused me of anything, but the unspoken anxiety settled into the flat all the same, hovering in every conversation about money. I felt it in the way she'd look at me when I was still on the sofa at 2 p.m, in the way her face would tighten when another rejection email came through. We stopped having sex, stopped really talking, just existed in parallel, waiting for something to change. When she eventually said she needed space, it came without drama. No shouting, no thrown accusations. She just sat down one evening and explained, very calmly, that she felt like everything had stalled, that she couldn't live in this suspended state anymore, not knowing when or if things would improve. She said she still cared about me, but that she needed to think about her own future. I didn't argue. How could I? She was right. I understood her point far too well to pretend otherwise. She moved out in December, a week before Christmas, took her stuff over 3 trips in a hired van, and each time she came back for another load, the flat looked more wrong. After she left for the last time, I walked through the rooms and realized how much of what made the place feel like home had been hers. Not just physical things, but the rhythm of daily life. The routines that had been keeping me anchored. After that, the flat felt strangely hollow, not empty. All my stuff was still there, but hollow, like a shell. Days stretched in uncomfortable ways. I'd lose track of time, look up from my laptop, and realize it was dark outside and I hadn't eaten. Nights became longer than they had any right to be. I'd lie awake listening to the pipes click and the radiators clank, and the distant traffic hum outside, aware that time was passing but unable to measure it properly. 3 in the morning felt the same as midnight, felt the same as 5 a.m. It was during those nights that I started spending more time online. Not doing anything in particular, just scrolling. Reddit mostly, Twitter, YouTube. It gave my thoughts somewhere else to sit, something to focus on besides the growing certainty that I'd fucked up my life beyond repair. I've always been comfortable with computers, the sort of competence that comes from familiarity rather than talent. I'm not a programmer or anything, but I understood how information connected, how people left traces of themselves behind without realizing, how easy it was to build a picture of someone's life if you knew where to look. Social media, public records, cross-referencing details. At the time, that knowledge felt harmless, academic even. Something I'd never imagined using outside of work. The idea came to me one night in late January, while scrolling through Reddit, half asleep, in a thread about alternative ways of making money online. Most of the suggestions were predictable and useless. Match betting, dropshipping, taking surveys for pennies. But one comment stood out precisely because it didn't try to sell anything. The person mentioned, very casually, that there were research opportunities on the dark web for people who were good at gathering information. They said it with such matter-of-fact certainty that I found myself reading it again and again. They'd included a link, not directly to anything illegal, just instructions on how to access hidden services. I told myself I was only curious when I clicked it. Told myself the same thing as I read the instructions, downloaded Tor, and spent an hour figuring out how to navigate to a site that looked disappointingly normal. Plain, text-heavy, functional, like a really bad version of Craigslist from 2004. The pages were stripped down, lacking any visual noise. Forums dominated most of the space, filled with long threads discussing services and reputations in tones that were unsettlingly professional. It didn't feel like a criminal underworld, more like a parallel bureaucracy, governed by its own rules and expectations. People talked about vendors the way you talk about contractors, rating their reliability, their communication, how quickly they delivered. I spent several nights just reading, telling myself that observation didn't count as participation, that I was just curious about how this world worked. Eventually, I came across a listing looking for what they called a data coordinator. The description was vague, but not mysterious. They needed someone to collect publicly available information about named individuals and compile it into clear, organized reports. Basic research skills required. Attention to detail, discretion. What made me stop and really consider it was one phrase: publicly available information. That detail became the hinge on which all my justifications rested. I told myself that if I wasn't hacking or breaking into anything, then it wasn't really wrong. I'd just be organizing data that already existed. The digital equivalent of putting scattered papers into a folder. Anyone could do this if they knew where to look. I'd just be doing it more efficiently. The pay was reasonable, but not extravagant. A few £100 per report. That made it feel legitimate somehow, like a real job rather than something shady. I spent several nights deliberating, checking my bank account, looking at the bills piling up. Then, around 3 in the morning on a Tuesday, I applied. 2 days later, I received my first request. It came through an encrypted message, just a name and a general location in Leeds. Nothing else. No context, no explanation of why they wanted the information. I remember staring at it for a long time, expecting to feel a sense of alarm that never came. The work itself unfolded with surprising ease. Social media provided an outline of the man's life. LinkedIn showed where he worked. Public records filled in the gaps. Electoral roll. Company's house. Land registry. With enough patience, routines began to emerge naturally. Patterns that were invisible in isolation but obvious when viewed together. He went to the same gym 3 times a week, had lunch at the same cafe on Fridays, posted about football on Twitter every weekend. When I finished, I'd assembled a detailed portrait of a stranger's life, where he lived, where he worked, how he spent his time, what car he drove, who his friends were. I sent the report through the same encrypted channel and waited, feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. What if it wasn't good enough? What if I'd missed something obvious? What if they decided I wasn't up to the task? The payment arrived the next day. Bitcoin, converted to pounds and deposited into my account. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming. Not just about the money, though that mattered. It was about feeling useful again, competent, like I still had value, like I could still do something well. For the first time since losing my job, I felt like I could breathe properly, like maybe I wasn't completely worthless. More requests followed quickly, 1 or 2 a week at first, then more. I developed templates, checklists, shortcuts. The work became routine. Methodical rather than improvisational. I could complete a basic profile in a few hours now, a detailed one in a day. The people I researched stopped being individuals and became just data points, collections of habits and timestamps, numbers on a spreadsheet. I didn't let myself think about what the information might be used for. Debt collection maybe, private investigators, background checks. I told myself it was probably nothing sinister, just boring commercial stuff. And even if it wasn't, well, I was only gathering information that was already public. I wasn't doing anything illegal. Not technically. By March, it had become my primary income. I was making more than I had at the agency, working from home in my pajamas. I stopped sending out job applications, stopped checking recruitment sites. This was working. Why go back to a 9-to-5 when I could do this? The first disruption came in late April. I received a request marked as urgent, accompanied by a payment significantly higher than usual. Double my normal rate, transferred up front. The name was Emma Hartley. The location was Stockport. That was it. No other details. No explanation for the urgency or the premium. I noticed both things, the urgency, the money, and still I chose not to ask why. Curiosity had already been replaced by necessity, or maybe I just didn't want to know. Emma's digital footprint was extensive in a way that now feels painfully intimate to recall. She was a nurse, worked night shifts at Stepping Hill Hospital. Her Instagram was public, full of selfies and pictures of her morning runs. Fitness apps revealed her exact running routes, the time she went, how long each run took. Facebook showed her shift patterns. She'd post about having a rough night at work, about looking forward to days off. Location tags placed her at specific cafes, specific parks, specific pubs. By the time I finished the report, I knew her routines with a familiarity that felt wrong even as I was compiling it. I knew she ran at 6 in the morning on her days off, that she stopped at the same Starbucks afterward, that she lived alone in a ground floor flat, that her car was parked on the street because the building didn't have dedicated spaces, that she usually worked Tuesday through Thursday nights and had her phone on Do Not Disturb during the day because she needed to sleep. I sent the report and told myself not to think about it, tried to push it out of my mind. But something felt different this time. The amount of detail I'd gathered, the precision of her patterns, the fact that someone had paid double to get this information quickly. 3 weeks later, I was drinking coffee and half watching TV when I opened the Manchester Evening News on my phone. The headline hit me like a punch to the stomach. Stockport nurse missing after night shift. There was a photo. Emma Hartley, the same face I'd been staring at for hours while building her profile. I read the article 3 times, 4 times. She'd left work at 7:30 in the morning. Her car was still in the hospital car park. She hadn't answered calls or messages. Colleagues were worried. Police were investigating. The details aligned too closely with what I documented. The hospital, the shift pattern, the usual time she'd leave. I told myself it was coincidence. Had to be. People go missing all the time. It didn't mean anything, couldn't mean anything, because admitting otherwise would have meant confronting a responsibility I was not prepared to face, would have meant acknowledging that I'd helped someone do something terrible. I avoided my computer for several days, didn't check messages, didn't take any new requests, but financial reality eventually pushed me back to work because fear alone doesn't stop bills from arriving. And I had rent due, council tax, electricity. I couldn't afford to stop. The message that followed didn't come through the usual system. It arrived directly, somehow, in my regular email, which should have been impossible. I'd been careful about keeping things separate, used different devices, different networks, but there it was, in my inbox, with no sender name. Just a subject line. Excellent work. The message praised my discretion and attention to detail, said they had a special project that required someone with my particular skills. 5 individuals across the Northwest, profiles needed within a week. The figure attached was more than I'd earned in the previous 2 months combined. Before I could even respond, before I could think about whether to accept, half the payment transferred into my account. That was when I understood, fully and clearly, that whatever legitimacy I'd imagined no longer existed. This wasn't debt collection or background checks. This was something else entirely. Something I should walk away from, should go to the police about, should refuse absolutely. I accepted anyway. The task involved 5 people, 3 in Manchester, 1 in Liverpool, 1 in Bolton. Each profile required a level of detail that went far beyond my previous work. Not just routines and locations, but vulnerabilities, security systems, household layouts, family members, financial situations. I spent that week in near isolation, barely sleeping, working obsessively, accessing databases I should never have seen, combining information in ways that made me increasingly uneasy. I knew what I was doing by then, couldn't pretend otherwise, but I kept going because I'd already taken half the payment and because stopping would have meant admitting to myself what I'd already become. When I sent the final report, the remaining payments arrived within minutes. Looking at my bank balance, I felt briefly untouchable, like I'd gotten away with something, like I was smarter than everyone else. That feeling lasted less than a week. News reports started appearing. A break-in in Didsbury, fraud case in Liverpool, an assault in Bolton. Each one aligned too closely with the profiles I'd created to dismiss as coincidence. The break-in happened at exactly the time I'd identified as optimal, when the residents were at their weekly evening class, The fraud-targeted accounts I'd specifically noted were vulnerable. The assault victim was attacked on the route I'd mapped as isolated and poorly lit. I stopped reading after the third incident. By then, denial felt more dishonest than knowing. I tried to stop. Stopped responding to messages. Stopped checking the encrypted channels. Told myself I was done. That I'd made enough money to last a few months. That I could go back to looking for legitimate work. That I could pretend the last few months hadn't happened. Then things got strange. My account started behaving oddly. Emails disappeared from my inbox. Ones I'd definitely received. Ones I'd read multiple times. My phone started doing things I couldn't explain. Opening apps on its own. The camera light coming on when I wasn't using it. Messages I'd sent vanishing from my conversation history. Then came the message, short and direct. You are either an asset or a liability. Choose wisely. The photograph arrived the next morning. It showed me sitting at my desk, face illuminated by my laptop screen, taken from outside the flat. Through the window, at night, the angle suggested it was taken from the street, maybe from a car. The timestamp was from 2 nights earlier. I'd been alone in the flat, thought I was safe, thought I was anonymous. Seeing myself from that perspective made something inside me collapse, because it demonstrated, with brutal clarity, how easily the same techniques I'd used on others could be applied to me. I knew my own patterns, knew my routines, knew exactly how vulnerable I was. And now someone else knew them too. I went to the police the next day, walked into the nearest station and told them I needed to report a crime. When they asked what had happened, I said I wanted to report myself. They arrested me that afternoon, took my laptop, my phone, everything. Interviewed me for hours across multiple days. I told them everything. Every request I'd taken, every profile I'd built, every piece of information I'd gathered. Showed them how to access the forums, how the payment system worked, everything I knew about the people I'd worked for, which wasn't much. I cooperated completely, not because I expected leniency, but because I no longer believed in the possibility of undoing what I'd already set in motion. They charged me with multiple offenses: conspiracy, computer misuse, data protection violations. The solicitor they assigned me said I'd probably get prison time. Said cooperation would help, but wouldn't erase what I'd done. I told him I understood. Now I'm waiting for my court date. Still in the same flat, still going through the same routines, but watching them with an awareness that didn't exist before. The police reassure me that the people I worked for are unlikely to pursue me further, that reporting them was the right thing to do, that I'll be safe. But reassurance doesn't erase knowledge. I know how these profiles are built, know how much information exists about any given person if you know where to look, know how patterns emerge from seemingly innocuous details, know how easy it is to map someone's entire life if you're patient enough. I know how patient the people who use this information can be, how they can wait weeks, months, for exactly the right moment, how they think in longer timescales than normal people do. And I know that somewhere, it's entirely possible that my life exists as a document, neatly organized, comprehensively detailed, created using the same methods I once relied upon. Someone knows where I live, where I shop, what time I usually go to sleep, which window doesn't lock properly, which neighbors are home during the day, when the police patrol this street. That knowledge doesn't fade with time. You'd think it would. You'd hope that eventually you'd stop checking over your shoulder, stop flinching at unexpected noises, stop analyzing every stranger who walks past your building. But it doesn't work that way. It just sinks deeper, becomes part of you, sits there in the dark where you can't quite see it, but you always know it's there. every time I hear footsteps in the hallway, every time a car idles outside for too long, every time my phone does something unexpected, every time I'm alone in the flat late at night, waiting, always waiting. I need to tell someone about this, even if it makes me look like an idiot. Maybe especially because it makes me look like an idiot. I've been carrying it around for nearly 2 years now, and the weight of not talking about it has become worse than the fear of judgment. So here it is. Back in early 2023, I was working as a graphic designer for a small agency in Newcastle. The job was fine, the pay was adequate, and I had a nice little flat in Jesmond that I shared with my girlfriend, Emma. We'd been together about 3 years at that point. Everything was stable, comfortable. I had no reason to go looking for anything else. But there's this thing about comfort, isn't there? It makes you complacent, makes you think you're untouchable. That bad things happen to other people, people who make stupid decisions or take unnecessary risks. I thought I was smarter than that. The whole thing started because I was bored one evening. Emma was visiting her parents in Durham, and I had the flat to myself. I'd finished the work I'd brought home, had eaten dinner, and found myself with nothing to do. I'd read articles about the dark web before, mostly out of idle curiosity. The usual sensationalist stuff about illegal marketplaces and hidden services. But I'd also read more measured pieces explaining that a lot of it was actually mundane. Whistleblowers, journalists, privacy advocates, people with legitimate reasons for wanting anonymity. I spent maybe 20 minutes getting access. It wasn't complicated. I'd expected it to be this elaborate process, but it wasn't. Just a few simple steps, and suddenly I was looking at a completely different internet. Sites with strange addresses, pages that loaded slowly, everything looking dated and slightly broken. For the first hour, I found exactly what I'd expected. Abandoned pages, broken links, marketplaces I had no intention of using. A few discussion boards where people talked about things that range from boring to disturbing. I was starting to think the whole experience was overrated when I stumbled across something called the vetted list. It wasn't advertised anywhere obvious. I found it through a link someone had posted on one of the discussion boards, mentioning it in passing. The description was vague, something about verified services for verified people. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was surprisingly professional. Clean design, minimal but functional, not like most of the sites I'd seen. The homepage explained that this was a directory of services, everything from research assistance to document retrieval to personal security. But unlike other directories, both the service providers and the people seeking services had to go through a screening process. The idea was that it weeded out scammers and time wasters. Both sides could trust that they were dealing with serious people. It sounded reasonable enough, almost legitimate. There was a button at the bottom, Apply for Access. I clicked it, not really intending to follow through, just curious about what the application process looked like. A form appeared. It asked for basic information: age, location, occupation, reason for seeking access. There were fields for providing an anonymous email address and uploading what they called verification materials. The instructions explained that applicants needed to prove they were real people with legitimate reasons for using the service. This could include professional credentials, references from existing users, or other documentation that demonstrated trustworthiness. The whole thing had this odd air of professionalism about it, like a job application or a membership form for an exclusive club. I suppose that's what made me fill it out. It felt harmless enough. I put down my real age and occupation, said I was from Newcastle, and wrote something vague about needing research assistance for design projects. Then I created a temporary email address and submitted the form without attaching any verification materials. I closed the browser and forgot about it. 3 days later, I remembered to check the temporary email account. There was one message waiting from an address that was just a string of random numbers and letters. The subject line said, "Application status. Additional information required." The message was brief and formal. It thanked me for my application and explained that they needed additional verification before they could grant access. Specifically, they wanted proof of identity, not a real name or official documents, but something that proved I was who I claimed to be. They suggested uploading a photograph of myself holding a piece of paper with my anonymous email address written on it, along with a photo of my current location or workspace. It seemed odd, but not unreasonable. They wanted to confirm I was a real person, not a bot or a scammer. I could understand that, and it wasn't asking for anything particularly sensitive. Just a photo. I took a quick picture on my phone. Me sitting at my desk in the flat, holding up a piece of paper with the email address scrawled on it. You could see part of my living room in the background, the sofa, the window, some of my design work pinned to the wall. Nothing that identified me or my exact location, but enough to prove I was real. I uploaded the photo and sent it back. 2 days later, another email arrived. This one said, "Verification successful. Access granted. Welcome to the vetted list." There was a link at the bottom. When I clicked it, I was taken back to the site, but now I could see more. The directory was extensive, dozens of categories, each containing listings for various services. Some were innocuous: document translation, data recovery, genealogy research. Others were more questionable: background checks, surveillance assistance, location tracking. Each listing included a brief description of the service, a rating based on previous users' feedback, and a contact method. Most used anonymous email or encrypted messaging. I clicked through a few out of curiosity, not intending to actually contact anyone. Then I noticed something at the top of the page, a notification. It said, "You have one pending request." I clicked on it. A message appeared, sent from another user on the platform. It was addressed to me, or rather, to my account. The message was short. "Saw your profile. Interested in working with you. Let me know if you're available." I hadn't created a profile. I'd only submitted an application. But apparently, the process of getting verified had also created some kind of user profile that others could see. I looked for a way to view my own profile and found it under account settings. What I saw made my stomach drop. My profile included the photo I'd sent. Me at my desk, holding the paper with the email address. But it also included information I definitely hadn't provided. My full name. My actual name, not some anonymous username. My address in Jesmond, complete with postcode. My phone number. My workplace, including the name of the agency and the address of our office. Underneath all that was a brief description. Graphic designer, Newcastle. Verified user. Available for consultation. I stared at the screen, trying to work out how they'd gotten this information. I hadn't given them my name. I hadn't given them my address or phone number. I'd been careful, anonymous. But somehow, they'd connected me to my real identity anyway. I looked at the photo again, the background, my living room. There were details visible if you looked closely. A piece of mail on the coffee table, too blurry to read but clearly there. A frame print on the wall, something I designed myself for a client. My laptop, partially visible on the desk. Small things, individually meaningless, but together they'd reverse searched me, or maybe facial recognition, or maybe they'd traced the temporary email somehow, linked it back to my actual accounts. I didn't know how they'd done it, but they had. They'd taken the information I'd voluntarily provided and used it to uncover everything else. I immediately tried to delete my account. There was an option in the settings, but when I clicked it, an error message appeared. Account deletion requires admin approval. Request submitted. I closed the browser and sat there feeling sick. I'd been so careful, or so I'd thought. Anonymous email, no real information, just a harmless photo. And they'd used it to identify me completely. The next day, I received another email. Different address, but the subject line made it clear it was from the vetted list. Account deletion request denied. The message explained that accounts could only be deleted under specific circumstances. Users who had completed transactions could request deletion after a waiting period. Users who had never engaged with the platform had to wait 30 days before deletion was permitted. This was to prevent abuse of the system. I hadn't engaged with anyone. I hadn't used any services. I just looked around. But apparently, that wasn't enough. I had to wait. I tried to ignore it. I didn't go back to the site. I didn't check the messages. I just tried to pretend it hadn't happened. Then, about a week later, something strange occurred. I was walking home from work one evening, the usual route through Jesmond, when I noticed someone walking behind me. A man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark coat. Nothing unusual about him. But he stayed behind me for several streets, matching my pace. When I turned onto my road, he turned too. When I reached my building, he stopped across the street and took out his phone. I went inside quickly, glancing back through the door before it closed. He was still there, standing on the pavement, looking at his phone, or looking at my building. I couldn't tell. I went up to my flat and looked out the window. He was gone. I told myself I was being paranoid. Newcastle wasn't a small city. People walked the same routes, stood on the same street. It didn't mean anything. But then it happened again. A few days later, different person. A woman this time, younger, standing outside the building when I came home from the shops. She wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there looking at her phone. But when I went inside, I watched from the window, and she stayed there for another 10 minutes before walking away. Then someone came into the agency, a man I'd never seen before, asking to speak to me specifically. The receptionist told him I was in a meeting and asked if she could take a message. He said no, he'd come back. He never did. Emma noticed I was anxious. I told her I was stressed about work, about a difficult client. She believed me. Why wouldn't she? I went back to the vetted list. I had to know what was happening. I logged into my account and checked the messages. There were dozens now, all from different users, all saying variations of the same thing. Available for work. Can help with your project. Let me know what you need. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't requested anything. But apparently, my profile was visible to other users, and they thought I was offering services, or looking for them. I couldn't tell which. Then I saw something else. My profile had been updated. The description now included additional information. Specializes in visual verification and documentation. Can provide detailed observations and reporting. I hadn't written that. Someone else had edited my profile. The site administrators, presumably. They decided what kind of services I was offering, based on God knows what. I sent a message to the site support, demanding they delete my account immediately, The response came within an hour. Your profile has generated interest from verified users. Deletion at this time would violate platform terms. Please wait until engagement period expires. Engagement period, like I was a product they were marketing. I stopped going to work, called in sick. Emma was worried, kept asking what was wrong, but I couldn't tell her. How do you explain that you accidentally signed up for something on the dark web, and now people might be watching you? It sounded insane. Then someone knocked on my door. Middle of the afternoon, Emma was at work. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. Average height, average build, wearing ordinary clothes. He knocked again, then checked his phone, then knocked a third time. I didn't answer. I stood there, completely still, barely breathing, until he finally left. I checked the vetted list again that evening. There was a new message, sent from the same account that had first contacted me weeks earlier. Confirmed your location. Ready to proceed when you are. Proceed with what? I hadn't agreed to anything. I hadn't engaged with anyone. I just submitted a stupid application and uploaded a stupid photo. I replied to the message. Wrong person. Delete my account. Leave me alone. The response came quickly. You created the profile. You submitted verification. You're on the platform now. That's how it works. I asked what they wanted from me, what they thought I'd agreed to. The response, observation services. That's what your profile says. People need eyes in Newcastle. You're local. You're verified. You're available. I wrote back that I'd never agreed to provide any services, that I'd only been curious, that this was all a mistake. The response, doesn't matter. You're verified now. Other users have paid for access to your services. You need to fulfill the request or face penalties. Penalties? What did that even mean? I asked what kind of requests, what they expected me to do. The response included a list, addresses in Newcastle and the surrounding areas, specific locations I was supposed to visit and photograph, times I was supposed to be there, people I was supposed to watch and document, all presented like a work schedule, like a list of deliverables for a project. I didn't respond. I closed the laptop and sat in my flat with all the lights off, curtains drawn, trying to work out what to do. Going to the police felt impossible. What would I tell them? I accessed the dark web and accidentally signed up for something illegal. They'd probably arrest me, or laugh at me, or both. The next day, Emma found me sitting in the dark. She'd come home from work early, worried because I hadn't been answering her calls. She turned on the lights and saw me there, still in yesterday's clothes. Laptop closed in front of me. She asked what was happening. She said I was scaring her. She said if I didn't tell her what was wrong, she was going to call my parents, or a doctor, or someone who could help. So I told her, not everything, but enough. I said I'd been looking at something online I shouldn't have been, that I'd given away information I shouldn't have given, that people were contacting me now, asking me to do things I didn't want to do. She asked if it was illegal. I said I didn't know. She asked if I was in danger. I said I didn't know that either. She wanted to go to the police. I told her we couldn't. She didn't understand why, but she trusted me enough not to push it. We decided to leave. Just pack up and go. Stay with her parents for a while, or find a new flat somewhere else, somewhere these people couldn't find me. It seemed like the only option. We spent that evening packing essentials, planning to leave first thing in the morning. Emma went to bed around 11. I stayed up, watching the windows, checking the street below every few minutes. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "Leaving won't help. You're verified. We know where you go." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, lights off, watching the street. Nobody came. Nothing happened. But the message sat on my phone like a weight. We left anyway. Went to her parents' place in Durham. I worked remotely for a few weeks. Told my boss I had a family emergency. Emma's parents asked questions, but Emma covered for me. Said I was dealing with some personal issues and needed space. I didn't check the vetted list during that time. I didn't look at my email. I just tried to pretend it had all gone away. But after a month, I had to go back. Back to work. Back to the flat. We couldn't hide at her parents' house forever. So we returned to Newcastle, and I went back to the agency, and everything seemed normal, except it wasn't. Small things kept happening. Mail going missing. Someone ringing our buzzer late at night, then no one being there when we checked. My bike, which I kept locked in the building storage area, moved to a different spot. Tiny things, easy to dismiss individually, but they kept happening. Then one morning, I found an envelope under my door. Inside was a printed sheet of paper. It showed my profile from the vetted list, complete with my photo, my information, and that description I hadn't written. At the bottom, handwritten in red pen, someone had written, "Still waiting." Emma saw it before I could hide it. She demanded to know what it meant, who had left it, what I'd gotten us involved in. I told her everything then, the whole story, the application, the photo, the verification process, the requests, all of it. She was furious, not just scared, but genuinely angry that I'd been so stupid, so careless. She said we needed to go to the police, consequences or not. I agreed. We went to the station that afternoon, told them the whole story, showed them the envelope, explained about the site and the profile and the people watching us. The officer who took our statement was patient, professional. He said they'd look into it, but he also said that dark web cases were complicated, difficult to investigate, hard to prove. He said we should be careful, change our locks, maybe install a camera, stay alert, but he couldn't promise anything would come of the report. Nothing did. Weeks passed. The police called once to say they were still investigating, but they hadn't found anything concrete. The site still existed. My profile was still there, and the small incidents kept happening. Eventually, we moved, left Newcastle entirely. Emma got a job in Edinburgh, and I went with her. New flat, new city, new routines. We told people we'd wanted a change, a fresh start. We didn't mention the real reason. It's been almost 2 years now. We're still in Edinburgh. Emma's doing well at her new job. I'm freelancing, working from home, avoiding offices and regular commutes where someone could track my movements. I haven't accessed the dark web since. I deleted all the software, changed all my passwords, got rid of that laptop entirely and bought a new one. My profile on the vetted list is probably still there. I have no way to check without going back, and I'm never going back. But sometimes I'll see someone on the street who seems to be watching me, or I'll notice the same car parked outside our building on multiple days, or I'll find something small out of place in our flat, something I'm sure I didn't move, and I'll wonder if they're still tracking me. If being verified is something you can never undo. If somewhere on that site, my profile is still active, still telling people I'm available, still providing my current location to anyone who pays for the information. Emma doesn't know I still worry about this. She thinks we left it all behind in Newcastle. And maybe we did. Maybe I'm just paranoid now, seeing threats where there aren't any. But I don't think so. I think when you give people access to your identity, when you let them verify who you are and where you are, you can never really take that back. It's out there. permanent, waiting for someone to use it. I was right about one thing at least. Bad things do happen to people who make stupid decisions. I just didn't realize I was one of those people until it was too late. I shouldn't have signed for the parcel. That's the cleanest way to start, and it's true. A courier said my flat number. I scribbled my name without thinking, and a small box became my problem before I'd finished my tea. The courier had that particular brand of impatience that comes with the territory. Shifting weight from foot to foot, electronic pad already angled toward me before I'd properly opened the door. His high-vis jacket was rain-spotted, and he smelled faintly of diesel and wet cardboard. Behind him, his van sat double-parked with hazards blinking, engine running like a heartbeat, counting down the seconds until he could move on to the next address. I signed because that's what you do when someone arrives at your door with purpose and a clipboard. The transaction felt automatic, muscle memory from years of online shopping and convenience. I hadn't ordered anything. The box was light, almost empty feeling, with the kind of generic brown tape that could have come from anywhere. Inside sat a cheap kitchen timer, the sort you'd find in a pound shop. White plastic with a wind-up mechanism that probably wouldn't last 6 months of normal use. Alongside it was a card with a QR code printed on stock so thin it felt like it might dissolve if you breathed on it wrong. No branding, no receipt, no return address on the package itself. Just my name and flat number written in block capitals with a thick black marker. I left the timer on the worktop next to the kettle, told myself the label had been misread somewhere along the delivery chain and meant to take it back to the depot after work. The plan had that comfortable vagueness of things you intend to do but probably won't follow through on. I forgot the way you forget to water plants or call relatives back. Late that evening, when the flat had settled into its familiar quiet, and I'd run out of reasonable ways to avoid thinking about the day, curiosity made a good case for itself. I scanned the code. The QR reader hesitated for a moment, as if uncertain, then opened a page that only loads on the dark web. I'm not an expert on these things. I just recognize the type of address from the sort of articles that make it sound novel and dangerous, like urban exploration for people who never leave their computers. The page was almost empty. Black background, pale text that seemed to glow against the darkness of my phone screen. A thin progress line that didn't seem to do much beyond prove something was loading. In the center was a live view of a stairwell. It looked like mine, painted brick walls with that particular shade of institutional cream that housing associations favor. A black handrail worn smooth by countless hands. The same wonky recycling notice by the fire door that had been askew for months. Someone had stuck it up carelessly, and no one had bothered to straighten it since. The image quality was grainy but clear enough to make me uncomfortable. A small counter in the corner ticked up steadily. Beneath it sat a single line of text. Place the kitchen timer on the landing rail at the top of the stairs within the next few minutes. I closed the page and stared at the kettle like it held an answer to a question I hadn't properly formed yet. The timer sat there looking innocent and slightly pathetic, the sort of object that might gather dust in a drawer for years before finally getting thrown away in a house move. But there was something about the precision of the instruction, the casual certainty that I would follow it, that made my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't name yet. Then I picked up the timer, stepped out into the corridor, and climbed to the landing. The building felt different at night, more aware of itself, full of small sounds that disappeared during the day, pipes ticking as they cooled, the distant hum of someone's television through thin walls, the soft mechanical breathing of the lift shaft. I balanced the timer on the rail and wound it until it ticked with that urgent, impatient sound that kitchen timers make. The metal was cold under my fingers. Back in my flat, I watched the countdown on my phone, refreshing the page every few seconds like I was waiting for exam results. The image never changed, just the empty stairwell, the timer perched on the rail like a small white bird. When the bell rang, sharp and artificial in the corridor's silence, the image flickered once and steadied. Nothing else happened. No door opened. No figure appeared in frame. The camera just kept its patient watch. I checked the plant pot in the lobby before bed, more out of nervous energy than expectation, and saw nothing. The lobby felt larger at night, shadows pooling in corners where the overhead lights couldn't reach. In the morning, pressed between pot and wall like a secret being passed along, there was an envelope with my name written in the same thick black marker. Inside was a £10 note, crisp and new, and silence that felt heavier than the money. It felt like a prank made to prove a point about how little it takes to move a person. A social experiment maybe, or some art student's thesis project on urban compliance. The kind of thing that would make sense in a gallery context, with a placard explaining the theoretical framework. 2 days later, a second parcel arrived. This time I hesitated before signing, pen hovering over the electronic pad while the courier waited with practiced patience. But hesitation isn't the same as refusal, and muscle memory won out again. The box held self-adhesive hooks, the sort you stick to bathroom tiles to hang towels, a small roll of clear tape, and another card with the familiar QR code. The same page loaded, only this time the camera had moved to sit lower, tucked somewhere behind the fire extinguisher near the glass front door. The view took in the entrance area, the row of postboxes with their scratched metal doors, the first few steps of the main staircase. The instruction was more specific this time. Tape a hook to the underside of the top step above the postboxes, on the left, so the dark edge of it shows just beyond the lip if you crouch and look up. It felt petty and technical and almost funny, like following instructions in a particularly boring manual. I pressed the hook into place with my thumb, the adhesive strip warming slightly under pressure. The positioning had to be exact, visible from below but not obvious to anyone walking normally up the stairs. I found myself checking the angles, making small adjustments, taking an odd satisfaction in getting it precisely right. When I walked away, I listened for any door opening, any sound that might indicate I was being watched, but heard nothing except the building's usual background hum. Later that evening, I refreshed the page and watched the stream show a gloved hand reach carefully into frame. The hand moved with deliberate economy, hanging a tiny metal tag on the hook, something small and dark that caught the light briefly before settling into shadow. The hand withdrew quickly, like a fox slipping through a garden, there and gone in the space between one breath and the next. Watching it felt like witnessing something I wasn't supposed to see, even though the whole point was clearly that I should see it. The next morning, another envelope was tucked behind the pot. More cash, another £10 note with the same crisp newness, and one neat sentence written in blue ballpoint. The hook has been helpful and more will be expected soon. The handwriting was careful, anonymous, the sort of script you might use when filling out official forms. The third parcel landed on a Friday morning when I was meant to catch a train to Derby to see my stepdad. I nearly ignored the buzzer because I was running late and had that particular kind of pre-journey anxiety that makes every small delay feel catastrophic. But the sound was insistent, and ignoring buzzers in a building like ours feels antisocial in a way that's hard to explain. The box held a rubber door wedge, the triangular kind that probably cost less than £1, a small USB torch with a wrist strap, and a card with the same QR link. The camera had moved again, this time facing the rear corridor by the exit to the bin store. This part of the building always felt forgotten, narrower than the main corridors, with pipes running along the ceiling and a persistent smell of damp concrete. The instruction was simple. Wedge the rear door ajar at roughly this time this evening. Shine the torch once into the corridor so the lens flares white. Walk away and return after a short while to remove the wedge. Payment will be the same. I moved my train by an hour, called my stepdad to explain I'd be late, and spent the afternoon with a low-level anxiety humming in my chest like a phone set to vibrate. When evening came, I did exactly what was asked. The torch beam fogged the image for a second, turning the screen pure white before settling back to show the empty corridor. Within a minute, a finger appeared at the glass from the outside, just the tip of one finger tapping once against the door like a coded message. I removed the wedge and locked the door, testing the handle twice to make sure it was secure. Another envelope was waiting that night, and I told myself it was some odd favor for a neighbor who liked sending people on little errands. Maybe someone with mobility issues who couldn't manage stairs easily, or an older resident who'd worked out an elaborate system for getting help without having to ask directly. The explanation felt comfortable, so I let it settle and tried not to think too hard about the finger at the glass. There was a man 2 doors down who carried a gym bag most mornings. He'd helped me with a flat-pack wardrobe once, holding panels steady while I fumbled with the Allen key, making the sort of cheerful small talk that makes mundane tasks bearable. He held doors for people with pushchairs and took parcels in when neighbors were out. The kind of casual community-minded gesture that keeps apartment buildings functioning. I mention him now because later I saw his photo on a local news website and recognized the same forearms and half smile. And I want you to understand that I knew who he was as a person before I knew what happened to him. Before his photo appeared in the news, the tasks kept creeping towards something that, at first glance, still looked normal. The next delivery contained blank lanyard sleeves, the sort used for conferences and workplace ID cards, and a set of numbered cards with official-looking fonts. The page asked me to slide one card into a sleeve and hang it on the hook under the step, then sit on the stairs at a particular minute and pretend to scroll through my phone. I positioned myself on the 3rd step up from the lobby, back against the wall, trying to look like someone killing time while waiting for a friend or a delivery. The building hummed around me with the particular sounds that old blocks make when pipes move hot water around and lift motors cycle through their routines. A woman with a pushchair needed help with the heavy front door, and I stood automatically to hold it open, feeling like I was breaking a rule I hadn't been told about, but should somehow understand. Later, I watched a grainy loop of myself looking appropriately bored and absorbed in my phone screen. The footage had that slightly unreal quality of security camera footage, compressed and pixelated in a way that made everything look like it was happening underwater. The lanyard had vanished from the hook. Another envelope appeared behind the plant pot the next morning, another £10 note, another brief message. Timing was good. I kept telling myself I hadn't done anything wrong. I'd stuck a hook under a step and wedged the door for a few minutes. I'd placed a cheap lanyard where no one would notice unless they were specifically looking for it. The requests were clearly designed to make me feel like a bystander to my own actions, a bit player in someone else's story. That was the point, I thought, to demonstrate how easily ordinary people could be drawn into small conspiracies without ever feeling like conspirators. One morning, the man with the gym bag didn't collect a parcel from the lobby shelf where the postman leaves packages too big for the slots. It sat there all day, a brown box with his name clearly visible on the label, the sort of thing that usually disappears within hours of being delivered. In the evening, someone on the building's WhatsApp group asked if anyone had seen him, because his phone was going straight to voicemail and he'd missed a standing arrangement. I wasn't part of the group. I'd never been one for building social media, but I saw a screenshot from a neighbor who forwards everything. We all know how that kind of question changes a corridor. People start looking through peepholes before stepping out, and the lift feels like a waiting room where everyone's pretending not to be anxious. Conversations by the postboxes become briefer, more purposeful. The building's rhythm shifts in subtle ways, like a piece of music played slightly too fast. The next parcel contained a heavy padlock with a brass body and a chrome shackle, and a key that looked newly cut. The page told me to swap the old lock on the rear gate for this one at roughly 2 o'clock the following afternoon, then hang the old lock with the new key threaded through it on the inside mesh of the gate, and shut the gate without engaging the latch. Someone would collect the old lock shortly after. I did it because by then, consistency felt safer than refusal, and because not doing it felt like stepping suddenly into harsh light after hours in comfortable darkness. The old lock came away easily. The screws were already loose, as if someone had prepared for this moment. The new lock clicked into place with satisfying precision. I threaded the key through the old lock shackle and hung it where the instructions specified, testing to make sure it was secure but easily removable. I can't pretend I didn't think about the man with the gym bag as I turned the screwdriver. The weight of the old lock in my hand felt significant in a way I couldn't articulate. That night, I listened through the thin wall that separated our flats, straining to hear his usual evening routine. The shower running, music playing softly, the familiar domestic sounds that form the background soundtrack of apartment living. I heard nothing. Another day passed, then another. It's remarkable how easily a person slips out of the rhythm of a building, and how the building just continues its routines as if nothing has changed. I tried, briefly, to ignore the page. For 3 days, I didn't scan the code that came with the next package. The box sat unopened on my kitchen counter, and I told myself this was where I drew the line. Then a message arrived on the throwaway email account I'd used for parcel delivery confirmations, an account I thought was anonymous and forgotten. The message contained a link, a specific time, and a request to watch. The casual certainty that I would comply felt like a hand on the back of my neck. I watched. The stream showed the view from inside the bin store, that concrete walled space at the back of the building where the wheelie bins lived among the spider webs, and the perpetual smell of decomposition. The camera sat somewhere high near a water pipe, looking down at the metal bin frames and plastic lids that never quite fitted properly. Even through the screen, I could almost taste that heavy, sour smell that clings to the back of your throat. A countdown timer appeared in the corner and began to sink towards 0. When it reached the minute I'd been given, the rear door opened with the particular grinding sound it made when the bottom scraped against the concrete threshold. 2 people pushed a trolley in, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who belonged there. The trolley carried flat boxes wrapped in brown paper and plastic sheeting, packages that looked official and mundane and somehow ominous all at once. They worked quickly and methodically, arranging the boxes with care, checking something on a phone screen, making small adjustments to the positioning. The stream didn't provide sound I could properly follow, just a muffled echo that might have been voices or might have been the building's ventilation system. When they finished, they left as quietly as they'd arrived, and the door eased shut, as if the building had taken a slow, careful breath. The official updates, when they came, arrived without drama. A small memorial appeared by the front door, a cheap bouquet from a supermarket, and a laminated photo of the man with the gym bag, his arm around a golden retriever, both of them squinting into sunshine somewhere that looked like a park. Someone from the council knocked on doors, asking routine questions about whether we'd noticed anything unusual with the bins, any strange smells, any disturbances in the area. People began double locking their flat doors and checking the spy holes before answering knocks. A few new faces appeared in the building, taking over flats that had suddenly become available. The turnover felt faster than usual, but housing in this part of town moved quickly anyway. Days grew thinner, more cautious. I tried to keep my head down and treat stillness like safety, avoiding eye contact in corridors and timing my comings and goings to minimize encounters. Another parcel arrived wrapped like a book, the kind of careful packaging that suggested contents more fragile than kitchen timers and door wedges. Inside was a stack of small laminated cards with official-looking notices printed in the same font the Housing Association used for maintenance announcements. The page asked me to slide one under the door of flat 3B after dark. The card explained that there would be a routine fire alarm test the following day, and residents shouldn't be concerned if they heard people in high-visibility jackets moving through the corridors during that period. It sounded exactly like the dull, bureaucratic notices that appeared regularly in our postboxes, the kind of thing you scan quickly before recycling. I did it because fear of the alternative had already moved into my flat like an unwelcome roommate, settling into corners and making itself comfortable. The card slipped easily under the door with barely a whisper of sound. The next morning, 2 men in safety vests walked past my door in perfect step, their boots making identical sounds on the corridor carpet. They vanished through the rear exit I'd wedged open weeks earlier, and I realized I was holding my breath until I heard the door click shut behind them. The page showed only the stairwell, looping calmly as always. The timer in the corner kept ticking with what felt like mechanical commentary on my complicity. The parcel that felt like a threat before I even opened it arrived on a Tuesday morning when rain was turning the windows grey and the building felt more enclosed than usual. My name was printed in block capitals across the brown paper, and the weight distribution felt wrong. Too light in some places, too heavy in others. Inside was a plug-in door chime, the sort you buy in the electrical aisle of supermarkets, and a small black wireless button with adhesive pads on the back. The card's instructions were precise. Place the chime in the hallway near the front door. Fix the button outside above the letterbox where the postman would see it, but might not think to comment on it. The accompanying link now showed a view looking outward through the building's glass front door to the street beyond. A final line said that when the chime sounded, I was to do nothing at all. Just listen and wait, and continue whatever I was doing as if nothing had happened. It rang once, in the small hours when the building was deepest in sleep, and the only sound should have been heating pipes and distant traffic. A single, neat electronic tone that seemed to hang in the air longer than it actually lasted. I lay in bed waiting for a second chime that never came. My heart rate elevated in the specific way that comes from being woken by unfamiliar sounds. The building stayed perfectly still around me. It rang again, after what felt like an hour but was probably only minutes. Then silence that stretched until I fell back into thin, restless sleep, full of dreams about corridors and cameras and hands reaching through letterboxes. When I woke properly, grey daylight was seeping through the curtains and rain was still tapping against the windows like someone asking politely to be let in. When I opened the door for my usual morning trip to the corner shop for bread and milk, the button had vanished. Only a small smear of adhesive remained on the paintwork, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. An envelope lay on the doormat, not behind the plant pot this time, but directly addressed to me in a way that felt like an escalation. The photo inside showed my hallway from a low angle, taken through the letterbox slot, looking toward the chime plugged into the socket by the front door. No message accompanied it. The point was proximity, intimacy, the demonstration that privacy was an illusion I'd been allowed to maintain until now. Another link arrived in my email later that day with a timestamp for the evening. I watched because obedience had become a reflex, a learned response that bypassed conscious decision-making. The camera had moved again to cover the main lobby, the postboxes with their scratched metal faces, the first stretch of corridor, and just enough of the stairwell to catch movement between floors. The timer counted down to the specified minute. At exactly the right moment, the main door opened and 3 men entered. 2 carried a step ladder between them with practiced ease, while the third followed with a package tucked under his arm like something valuable and fragile. They moved through the space with the confidence of people who had studied the building's rhythms and understood its weak points. One of them went straight to the lift and pressed the call button. The second set up the step ladder with quick, efficient movements. The third approached the post boxes, spun the combination dials on 2 different boxes as if he had memorized the numbers, and slid his package into one of the opened compartments. Then he paused, facing the stairs in a way that suggested he was checking the quality of silence, rather than looking for any specific person. I closed the stream and sat holding my phone like it might provide warmth or comfort. The image of the man's pause stayed with me, that moment of professional assessment, cataloguing the building's mood and finding it satisfactory for whatever came next. Later that day, the police posted an update saying they were renewing their appeal for information about a second person, last seen in the company of the missing man. They were particularly keen to trace anyone who had received unexpected parcels or packages recently. I tried to imagine calling the number provided and explaining the correct amount of truth, enough to be helpful, not enough to implicate myself in whatever had been happening around me. My throat tightened with the petty anxiety that comes when you've run for a bus and then changed your mind at the last moment, leaving you stranded on the pavement feeling foolish and conspicuous. How do you explain that you've been following instructions without understanding their purpose? That you've been complicit in something you can't name? That night the chime rang again, once, and stopped. In the morning, there was another envelope behind the plant pot. No cash this time. Just a laminated card with a single sentence that read like a line from a workplace safety manual. Prop the front door open tomorrow for a short window after 9 a.m. The instruction had the bland authority of something that shouldn't be questioned, the kind of request that sounds reasonable until you think about it too carefully. I stood at the top of the main staircase and looked down at the entrance, at the heavy door with its security lock, and the thin mat where packages sometimes waited for collection. I thought about how small actions accumulate into patterns you don't recognize until it's too late to pretend you don't understand what you've been part of. The front door was propped open at the specified time the next day, not by me. A folded gym leaflet sat wedged under the bottom edge like a paper tongue, holding the door just wide enough to slip through without triggering the automatic closing mechanism. I watched from the window of the stairwell, 3 floors up, as 2 familiar figures approached from the street with the unhurried confidence of people keeping appointments. I understood then that my part in this had never been essential. I had been used to test the building's rhythms and vulnerabilities, to establish patterns and timing, to identify the residents who noticed things and those who didn't. The serious work, whatever that had been, no longer needed my small contributions. They had mapped the building's habits, learned the names on the buzzers, developed an intuitive feel for who left when and which doors stayed locked during the day. I had been the practice run, the proof of concept, someone's experiment in urban compliance and the gradual erosion of boundaries. The realization felt like discovering you've been playing a game where only one person knew the rules. I moved a few weeks later, citing work commitments to the letting agent rather than trying to explain the real reasons. My deposit went toward a smaller place across town, near a parade of shops where the woman behind the post office counter learns your name if you visit regularly enough. The new building has thicker doors, better locks, and no convenient plant pot by the entrance where messages might be left. I don't keep electronic chimes plugged into wall sockets anymore. I still answer the door buzzer because social conditioning runs deep, but I look through the peephole each time and keep the security chain engaged until I'm certain about who's calling. It makes me feel both faintly ridiculous and more genuinely awake than I'd been in years. This isn't a public service announcement or a warning designed to make you more suspicious of your neighbors. It's just a record of how soft pressure works when applied in careful increments. A package arrives containing something boring and unthreatening. A web page asks for a favor that costs nothing and harms no one. The first task pays for itself and makes you feel clever for discovering a small, victimless corner of urban life where rules are more flexible than you'd assumed. The second favor hides behind helpfulness and community spirit. The third is about timing and access. The fourth introduces the possibility of consequences you hadn't considered. Then someone you know by sight vanishes from the building's daily rhythms, and a cheap bouquet appears by the front door. A laminated card slides under a neighbor's door, and people in high visibility vests walk through secure areas because no one looks twice at official seeming uniforms. If you want an ending with resolution and justice, I don't have one to offer. Take the simplest version instead. A door on a damp morning, held open by a gym advertisement. A pair of men who look like they belong, walking into a building without hurry or concern. A third who pauses in the lobby and seems to glance up toward the higher floors, as if checking the time or confirming that expected schedules are being maintained. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make witnesses out of bystanders. Just the slow, methodical click of small tasks becoming a comprehensive plan, of individual complicity adding up to collective vulnerability. I don't scan random QR codes anymore. I dispose of unsolicited cards and packages without opening them. I still think sometimes about that first kitchen timer ticking on the landing, the mechanical bell that rang in an empty corridor, and the brief moment of relief I felt when nothing immediately dramatic happened. That might have been the safest moment in the entire sequence, when I knew just enough to be curious, but not enough to be properly frightened. Now I know more, and the knowledge isn't particularly useful. It just sits there in the back of my mind, quiet and patient as a plant pot by a door, waiting for the next person to reach into it without thinking to look first. The game is still being played, I'm certain of that. Somewhere in the city, someone is signing for a package they didn't order, and curiosity is making its usual persuasive case for just one small favor, one tiny compromise, one harmless step across a line they can't yet see. I still can't look at a vegetable garden without seeing her face. Pale and perfect, surrounded by winter greens, planted like she belonged there. Emily was 24 years old when she disappeared. 24 years old when I photographed her body among the carrots and parsnips. 24 years old, and she'll never be 25. My name is Daniel. I'm a crime scene photographer for Thames Valley Police. And I'm about to tell you about the case that destroyed the peace in our quiet English village. About the man who buried a beautiful young woman in a community garden. About how someone who waved to you at the post office on Tuesday could be committing unimaginable acts on Wednesday, and how none of us saw it coming. It started on a bitter January morning in 2018. The kind of English winter day where the fog never quite lifts and everything feels damp right down to your bones. I remember scraping ice off my windscreen when the call came in. Something found at the Millfield Lane allotments. Suspicious circumstances. Attend with camera equipment. I'd been with Thames Valley Police for 15 years by then, documenting everything from domestic disputes gone wrong to drunk driving fatalities. I'd seen my share of death, learned to separate myself from it professionally. At least, that's what I told myself. My wife Emma says differently. Says I started going grey the year I joined the force, that I sometimes cry out in my sleep. She's probably right. You can't stare into the abyss without it staring back, as they say. The Millfield allotments have been part of Lower Barton since the war years. 78 little patches of earth where locals grow everything from prize roses to potatoes. My own granddad had a plot there until his arthritis got too bad. I'd spent countless childhood Saturdays helping him weed, mostly eating fresh peas straight from the pod when he wasn't looking. I knew every gravel path and garden shed by heart. But I'd never seen it like this, crawling with police, forensic tents gleaming white against the winter-dead landscape. Helena, our detective chief inspector, met me at the tape, her face grim. She'd grown up one village over, understood the impact this would have. Mid-40s, with short silver-streaked hair and the focused intensity of someone who'd clawed her way up through the ranks when female detectives were still a novelty in rural forces. Her expression told me everything I needed to know. This was bad. Emily lay in plot 23, as if she'd been tucked in for the night, not buried in frozen soil. 24 years old, doctoral student at Cambridge, environmental researcher with a promising future. Missing for 17 days after staying late at the university library. Her body had been arranged with unnerving care, like a gardener setting a delicate plant. Winter vegetables, carrots, parsnips, Brussels sprout stalks, circled her in perfect rings. Someone had washed her hair clean under her fingernails. Someone had treated her like a prize specimen. I knew Emily, not well, but enough to recognize her immediately. She'd grown up in Lower Barton, daughter of the local doctor. I'd photographed her graduating sixth form, covered the charity fun run she'd organized last summer for the village newsletter. She'd been back living with her parents while finishing her PhD thesis on soil microbiomes and sustainable agriculture. The irony of where she was found wouldn't escape anyone. The soil around her was meticulously tended, not a weed in sight, despite the winter dormancy. Each vegetable was spaced with mathematical precision, creating concentric circles around her body. The carrots formed the innermost ring, their feathery tops brushing against her shoulders. Parsnips came next, then Brussels sprouts on their tall, alien-looking stalks. In the weak January sunlight, with morning frost still glittering on the leaves, it almost looked beautiful. That was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. I remember the clicks of my camera shutter sounding obscenely loud in the hush that had fallen over the scene. Click. Evidence marker by her right hand. Click. The pattern of vegetables. Click. Her face, peaceful in a way that death rarely allows. Each image burned into my memory as permanently as onto the memory card. The post-mortem revealed the worst part. Soil in her lungs meant she'd still been breathing, however weakly, when placed in the earth. I've photographed hundreds of crime scenes, but that detail still haunts my dreams. The sensation of soil filling your mouth as consciousness fades. The pathologist estimated she'd been dead approximately 2 weeks, putting her death shortly after her disappearance. No sexual assault, no defensive wounds. Toxicology showed nothing unusual. She'd simply vanished from a busy university library and reappeared, buried in the fertile soil of her hometown. Emily had last been seen on a Tuesday evening in early January, working late at the Cambridge University Library. CCTV footage showed her leaving around 10:30 p.m., walking toward the bus station with her backpack slung over one shoulder. The heavy winter coat she wore was the same one her parents identified later, dark blue, knee-length, with a fur-trimmed hood. In the footage, she'd pulled the hood up against the light rain. Her face was barely visible, just a flash of profile as she passed under a streetlight. The last confirmed sighting came from a night bus driver who remembered dropping her at the village crossroads around 11:45 p.m. She'd been a regular on his route, always polite, always with a book or laptop open on night journeys. That evening, she'd been one of only 3 passengers. He remembered her getting off, turning toward the footpath that would take her through the village green, a shortcut home that she'd walked hundreds of times. Her parents reported her missing the next morning when they realized she hadn't come home. Her bed was undisturbed. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her laptop still sat in her university locker. A missing persons case was open, but there was little to go on. No enemies, no troubled relationships, no history of mental health issues or dangerous behaviors. Just a bright young woman who vanished on a rainy January night. The strangest thing, Plot 23 didn't belong to anyone. It had been vacant since old Arthur died 3 months earlier. The allotment committee had suspended new assignments due to some administrative issue with the council. Someone had been tending it anyway, hiding in plain sight among legitimate gardeners. Someone who knew the allotments well enough to avoid attention. Lower Barton is tiny, population under 9,000, the kind of place where the biggest news is usually someone's prize marrow at the village show. The kind of place where people leave doors unlocked and know the names of neighbors' dogs. That changed overnight. Suddenly, we were the village where Emily was found. The village where young women shouldn't walk alone. Emily's parents were destroyed. I didn't photograph their identification of the body. Another officer handled that. But I saw them leaving the morgue. 2 people physically bent by grief, holding each other up like damaged trees after a storm. The entire village felt their pain. Emily had been universally liked. Bright, kind, always quick with a smile or an offer to help. Memorial flowers appeared spontaneously by the allotment entrance. The primary school where she'd volunteered closed for a day of remembrance. I remember walking home from the scene that first day. The weight of my camera bag seemingly doubled. Neighbors who would normally greet me with casual waves were now gathering in doorways, expressions anxious, voices hushed as they exchanged theories and concerns. The street where Emily had grown up was lined with cars as friends and family arrived to support her parents. A media van was already parked discreetly at the end of the road, a reporter doing a piece to camera with the village green deliberately blurred behind her. Helena ran the investigation by the book. Door-to-door inquiries, allotment holder interviews, CCTV reviews from every shop and traffic camera within 10 miles. A dedicated tip line that rang constantly with locals reporting suspicious characters who usually turned out to be delivery drivers or visitors from neighboring villages. Officers combed through Emily's life looking for anyone who might have wished her harm. Her professors, her former boyfriends, the barista at her favorite coffee shop, but nothing suspicious emerged. Emily had been well liked, uncontroversial, without enemies. The press nicknamed the killer the gardener, and the case became national news. Emily's face, always the same photo of her laughing at her brother's wedding, appeared on every front page. I watched my hometown transform on live television, the drone footage making our familiar streets look sinister and exposed. News vans parked outside the Crown, our local pub. Journalists buying rounds for anyone willing to speak on camera about the quiet village rocked by tragedy, or the brilliant young scientist taken too soon. Some embraced the attention, most resented it. At home, Emma installed new locks on our doors and windows. She'd never bothered before, despite my job. Now she double-checked them before bed, started keeping her phone charged by her pillow. We have no children, couldn't have them, as it turned out. But I wonder how parents coped during those weeks, what lies they told to explain the sudden restrictions, the constant supervision. In the days following Emily's discovery, I was assigned to document every inch of the allotments, each of the 78 plots photographed in detail, each shed, compost bin, and water butt examined for evidence, each pathway walked with eyes trained on the ground for footprints, fibers, anything the killer might have left behind. I photographed hundreds of soil samples collected by forensic teams, each carefully labeled with location coordinates. The allotments revealed themselves to me in ways I'd never noticed before, despite growing up in their shadow. The careful organization of some plots versus the cheerful chaos of others. The handmade trellises and improvised coal frames. The different gardening philosophies expressed in layout choices and plant selections. And plot 23, unnervingly perfect in its precision. A demonstration garden rather than a working one. A stage set for a performance that only the killer understood. 3 weeks passed. Leads went nowhere. The initial shock began fading into uneasy routine. Officers from other districts were gradually reassigned. Helena looked increasingly haggard during our morning briefings, the pressure from above mounting as the case stalled. Emily's parents issued a heart-wrenching appeal for information. A £50,000 reward was offered by an anonymous local businessman. University friends organized a memorial scholarship in her name. Then came the first real break. A pensioner who walked his terrier around the perimeter of the allotments each morning reported seeing someone in plot 23 well before dawn several times in the weeks before Emily disappeared. Too dark to see clearly, just a figure working by torchlight. He hadn't thought anything of it. Many gardeners visited at odd hours, especially those with full-time jobs. But when questioned about specific dates, his calendar showed dog-walking notes that placed the nocturnal gardener in plot 23 3 days before Emily vanished, and again the day after. The forensic team returned to the plot with renewed focus. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed no other bodies were buried there. Microscopic examination of soil samples showed traces of chemical fertilizers not commonly used in home gardening, but found in professional landscaping. Fiber evidence included threads from high-end outdoor clothing brands, and most importantly, a partial boot print preserved in dried mud near the water tap. size 9 Wellington boots with a distinctive tread pattern. Sold by only 3 retailers in Cambridgeshire. Cross-referenced with purchase records, residence proximity, and horticultural knowledge, one name floated to the top. Edward, 46, landscape gardener, Lower Barton resident for 4 years. I knew him, not well, but enough to nod hello at the shop. He'd redesigned the planting beds outside the community centre the previous spring. Quiet man, efficient, particular about his work. Always wore those dark green wellies, even when not gardening. Said they were the most comfortable footwear he'd found. He lived in a modest cottage on the village outskirts. Slate roof, wisteria climbing the south wall, impeccable front garden with precisely trimmed box hedges and gravel paths without a stone out of place. The kind of home featured in weekend supplements about rural idylls. Quiet, polite, unremarkable. He volunteered at community events, nodded to neighbours but rarely conversed. The perfect background presence, forgettable by design. When investigators began digging into Edward's background, curious patterns emerged. He'd moved around frequently throughout his career, never staying in one place more than 5 years. His references were impeccable, but difficult to verify. Previous employers had retired, moved abroad, or businesses had closed. His landscape business operated primarily through word of mouth, with minimal paper trail. His financial records showed modest income, but surprising savings. A man who lived simply, but with attention to detail. Most disturbing was his connection to Emily. He'd redesigned the gardens at the medical practice where her father worked. He'd been contracted to advise on sustainable landscaping at Cambridge University's Environmental Science Building where Emily studied. He'd even worked briefly at the community gardens near the bus stop where she'd last been seen. Their paths had crossed multiple times, yet no one had connected them until now. The surveillance operation lasted 3 days. Edward followed a predictable routine, work during daylight hours, home by 6, rarely going out except to purchase groceries or visit his elderly mother in a care home in Cambridge. He attended church sporadically, volunteered for the occasional community event, kept himself to himself. So ordinary he became invisible. Yet there were anomalies. Late-night lights in his garden shed, frequent trips to remote nurseries for specialized plant specimens, an unusual number of gardening tools, far more than any professional would need, and most notably, no clients during the winter months, despite his financial records showing consistent income year-round. I wasn't part of the arrest team, but I saw the footage later. 6 officers approaching the cottage at dawn. Edward opening the door in pajamas and dressing gown, looking puzzled but not alarmed. No resistance, no dramatic scenes. Just a man calmly turning around to be handcuffed, asking with his eyes if he could put proper clothes on first. The search warrant revealed nothing immediately suspicious in his home. Gardening journals, plant photographs, certificates from horticultural courses, an organized Spartan existence. Then they found the cellar entrance behind a bookshelf in his kitchen, activated by removing a specific volume of the Complete Guide to Organic Gardening. The space below contained glass jars filled with soil samples, labeled by location and date. Hundreds of jars, thousands. A meticulous catalogue of earth from across Cambridgeshire and beyond. Some dated back 20 years to places Edward had previously lived. Each carefully labelled, organised by region, soil type, pH level. In the centre stood a workbench of polished oak. On it, a leather-bound journal filled with Edward's handwriting, neat, precise, almost architectural in its clarity. Pressed flowers marked certain entries. My hands shook as I photographed pages describing the transplanting of Emily, her preparation, the monitoring for signs of successful taking. The journal detailed his first noticing Emily at a university lecture on sustainable agriculture he'd attended as a continuing education requirement for his landscaping certification. He'd been struck by her questions about soil microbiomes, her understanding of mycorrhizal networks, her passion for the hidden life beneath the surface. He'd followed her research, read her published papers, attended more lectures where she spoke. In his distorted mind, she wasn't an object of desire, but a necessary component, the perfect human element to complete his experimental garden. Edward wrote of integrating humans into the growth cycle, of cellular transfer between people and plants. Emily wasn't simply murdered. She was, in his distorted mind, transformed into a hybrid plant-human entity that would enrich the soil. He described watching her for weeks, learning her routines, planning the optimal transplantation, with the care of a gardener preparing a delicate specimen for a new environment. The journal described their first direct interaction on the night she disappeared. He'd offered her a lift from the bus stop, recognizing her from lectures, presenting himself as a local landscaper interested in her research. The heavy rain had made his offer seem reasonable. She'd accepted, not recognizing him as the quiet man who occasionally tended her father's office gardens. His entry noted her intelligent conversation during the short drive and his regret at the necessary chemical intervention when he'd used chloroformed cloth as they approached his cottage instead of her home. One entry about Emily read that she showed promising signs of integration with surrounding specimens. Root structures appeared drawn to established position. He would monitor for evidence of nutrient exchange. Temperature remained suboptimal, but necessary given circumstances. No visible surface manifestation yet. He had been returning to the burial site regularly, checking for signs of some transformation that existed only in his mind. The vegetables planted around her body weren't symbolic. They were intended to be recipients of some imagined essence transferred from human to plant. In his twisted logic, he was creating a new form of hybrid existence. The most chilling discovery came in a small refrigerator hidden beneath the workbench. Inside, soil samples taken from directly beneath Emily, carefully dated and labeled Specimen E Day 1, Specimen E Day 7, and so on. Edward had been conducting regular biopsies of the soil surrounding Emily, searching for evidence of the transformation he believed was occurring. Microscopic analysis later showed these samples contained decomposition products. He had been scientifically documenting the natural processes of decay, interpreting them as signs of his imagined transformation. More disturbing still were the plans for future specimens found in a hidden compartment beneath the workbench. 5 more names, 5 more people who had unwittingly entered Edward's orbit, been catalogued for his grotesque garden, each with detailed notes about their routines, vulnerabilities, and optimal transplantation locations based on soil composition and sunlight patterns, each with a specific vegetable pairing chosen to maximize nutrient transfer potential, each with a timeline for harvesting that would have begun the following spring. Edward offered no resistance during arrest, expressed no remorse during questioning, appeared genuinely bewildered that his research was considered criminal. During one interview, which I watched through one-way glass, he patiently explained to Helena that his work would revolutionize our understanding of the human-plant relationship and offered to provide detailed notes to help scientists continue his research. Psychiatric evaluation found him suffering from a rare delusional disorder, possibly exacerbated by long-term exposure to certain agricultural chemicals found in his workshop. Further investigation revealed a family history of schizophrenia that he'd concealed, and evidence of a head injury sustained in his 20s that had never been properly treated. He was deemed unfit for trial and committed to Ravenswood Secure Hospital, where he reportedly tends the therapeutic garden with the same meticulous care he showed Emily. The press had a field day. "The gardener unmasked," screamed the headlines. Photos of Edward, always the same one, taken at a community fete where he'd won prizes for his tomatoes, plastered every front page. Journalists descended again on Lower Barton, this time hunting for neighbours who'd known him, trying to extract every detail of his quiet existence. His cottage became a macabre attraction, forcing police to maintain a cordon until interest finally waned. Emily's family retreated from public view. Their grief, so publicly displayed during the search, became private again once answers were found. They sold their home 6 months later, moving to Scotland to be near relatives. I sometimes wonder if they found peace there, away from the soil that had claimed their daughter. I hope so. The aftermath was almost worse than the investigation. The questions nobody could answer satisfactorily. How had we not known? How had we not seen? How had someone so profoundly disturbed lived among us undetected? The self-recrimination, the suspicion that lingered even after Edward was gone. The uncomfortable knowledge that evil had walked our streets wearing the most ordinary face imaginable. Lower Barton's healing began slowly. The allotments reopened, though many plot holders surrendered their tenancies, unable to face the soil that had concealed Emily. Plot 23 was transformed into a memorial garden. Emily's favourite flowers instead of vegetables. A wooden bench was installed at the allotment entrance, bearing her name and the simple epitaph, "She grew in our hearts." Helena received an official commendation for solving the case, though the toll it took was visible in the new lines on her face, the streak of grey that hadn't been there 6 months earlier. She transferred to headquarters the following year, moved into administrative work. We still meet occasionally for coffee. Neither of us mentions the case directly, but it sits between us like a third presence. Emma and I considered moving away. Many did, but Lower Barton is home, has been for generations of my family. Running away wouldn't erase the memories. Instead, we adopted a dog, a rescue Springer Spaniel named Bella, who gets me out walking every day, even when I'd rather hide indoors. Her uncomplicated joy in simple things has been its own form of therapy. The village appears normal now, 5 years later. The shop still sells local honey and homemade cakes. The pub quiz happens every Thursday. Children still play in the park. But beneath the surface runs the knowledge that evil grew among us undetected. That it presented as ordinary as a man with soil-stained hands who nodded good morning at the shop. That it existed season after season until circumstance brought it to light. I still photograph gardens sometimes, though not professionally. The ordered rows and careful spacing remind me that precision isn't inherently malevolent, that the same attention to detail cultivates beauty and nourishment just as easily as horror. I grow tomatoes in our back garden. Emma says it's my way of reclaiming something Edward tainted. She's probably right. She usually is. What remains unclear is whether Edward was an anomaly or a warning, whether his delusion was unique or an extreme version of humanity's complicated relationship with nature, whether, in our quest to control and cultivate the natural world, we risk cultivating something darker within ourselves. The allotments continue their seasonal cycle. Winter vegetables give way to spring greens, give way to summer abundance, give way to autumn harvest. The soil accepts what is planted without judgment or memory. New gardeners tend plots where Emily once lay, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what happened beneath their hands. Life continues, growth continues. But whenever I drive past the Millfield Lane allotments, I remember Emily's face among the winter vegetables. I remember the quiet gardener who believed humans were simply another crop to cultivate. And I check my door locks twice before sleeping. Because some harvests once reaped can never be undone. How long does it take before a coincidence stops being a coincidence? That's the question I kept asking myself through the autumn and into the winter. I'd ask it on the drive to work, ask it in the shower, ask it at 2 a.m. when sleep had given up on me, and I was lying in the dark running the same sequence of events through my mind for the 4th or 5th time that week. How many times does something have to happen before you stop calling it coincidence and start calling it what it is? I'm a practical man. I don't scare easily. I don't believe in things that don't have explanations. And the explanation I kept arriving at every time I ran the sequence was the one I didn't want to arrive at. Someone knew where I was, all the time, everywhere I went. I'll start at the beginning, which is what I should have done months before I actually did. My name is Neil. I'm 46 years old. I'm a secondary school geography teacher in Inverness. Have been for about 18 years. I live in a house on the west side of the city that I bought with my ex-wife 12 years ago and kept after the divorce because she'd moved to Aberdeen, and neither of us wanted to sell at the time, and then the time passed and I stopped thinking about it. The house is far too big for one person, and I've been meaning to do something about that for about 6 years and haven't. That's a fairly accurate summary of how I approach most of the things in my life that require a decision. I mean to do something and then, the time just passes. Anyway, I have a daughter, Kirsty, who is 20 and at university in Glasgow. I love her so much. We talk on the phone twice a week and see each other in the holidays and have the kind of relationship that I think both of us know could be warmer, but neither of us quite knows how to make it so. Her mother and I didn't have a bad divorce, as divorces go, I suppose. But Kirsty was 15 when it happened, and 15 is not a good age for that kind of disruption, and I think she absorbed more of it than she's ever said. I have 2 close friends from university, both still in the Highlands, both with families. I see them when I can, which probably isn't as often as I should. I run 3 mornings a week along the river, or I did until the thing I'm about to tell you made running alone feel different than it used to. I know I'm rambling, but I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the specific texture of my life before it happened. Ordinary, quiet, structured around work and small pleasures and the gentle, accumulated routines of a man living alone in a house that's slightly too large for him. Not a life with obvious drama in it. Not a life where you'd expect something like this to arrive. The first thing was in August, a Saturday morning, early. One of those Highland August mornings where the light comes in low and golden, and the mist is still sitting on the river, and the city feels half asleep. I was running my usual route, along the riverbank, past the suspension bridge, up through the Ness Islands, back along the east side. And as I came off the islands and onto the path, I had the sudden, very specific sensation of being watched. I don't mean a vague unease. I mean something precise and physical, a prickling across the back of my neck that made me slow down and look around. There was nobody obviously watching me. A couple of dog walkers in the distance, a jogger coming the other way who passed me without acknowledgement. Nothing wrong. I put it down to tiredness. I'd slept badly that week. and ran home and forgot about it. A week later, I was in a coffee shop in the city centre I used most Saturday mornings, reading the paper. And when I looked up from the paper, there was a man at a table near the window who was looking at his phone. Nothing remarkable about that. But when I looked again a few minutes later, he was still there, and the angle of his phone, held slightly high, screen not obviously active, was the angle of someone taking a photograph rather than reading something. I looked directly at him, and he lowered the phone and looked out of the window. And I told myself I was imagining things and drank my coffee and left. The third thing was the most specific, and it's the one that I should have acted on immediately and didn't. I was in a car park near Loch Ness on a Sunday afternoon in September. A place I went occasionally to walk. Nothing regular, not part of any routine, just a spontaneous drive out. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when a grey car pulled into the car park and parked at the far end. The driver didn't get out, just sat there. I wasn't paying close attention. I was looking at the lock, not the car park. But when I came back to my car an hour later, the grey car was still there, still occupied. And as I drove out of the car park, it pulled out a few seconds after me. I lost sight of it within a mile and told myself that two cars leaving a car park at similar times was not a story. In retrospect, I was working very hard to not see what was in front of me. The fourth thing was what broke it open. It was October, a Tuesday evening, and I'd stayed late at the school to mark a set of assessments and then driven to a supermarket on the retail park outside the city, which I didn't normally use. I had a local one I used most weeks, but I needed something they didn't stock. I was in the supermarket for about 40 minutes. When I came out and got back to my car, there was a piece of paper under the windscreen wiper. Not a flyer, not a parking notice. A folded piece of white paper with my name on it. Just my first name, Neil. I stood in the car park in the dark and looked at it for a moment before I opened it. Inside, in neat block capitals, it said, "I know you've noticed. It's fine. Just checking in. That's all." No signature, no number, no explanation. I stood there for what was probably 30 seconds but felt much longer. And I looked around the car park and there was no one paying any attention to me. Just shoppers loading bags into boots and a couple of teenagers on bikes near the entrance. Then I got in my car and drove home and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the piece of paper for a long time. Just checking in. The phrasing is what made it so horrible. Not threatening, not obscene, friendly almost. The kind of thing you'd text a friend you hadn't spoken to in a while. The deliberate casualness of it, pressed against the absolute abnormality of what it represented, was the most frightening thing about it. This was not a person who was unaware of how disturbing this was. This was a person who understood exactly how disturbing it was and was enjoying the specificity of it. I rang the police that evening. I want to be clear that I did that I didn't wait, didn't try to handle it quietly. Rang 101 and reported it, and gave the officer I spoke to the note and the details of everything I'd noticed since August. He took a report, and I was told someone would be in touch. I was in touch with a detective constable within 2 days, a woman who was thorough and took it seriously, and told me to keep a log of anything further and not to approach anyone I suspected of following me. I asked her directly whether she thought I was actually being followed, or whether this was more likely a one-off. She said she couldn't make that assessment yet, but that the note suggested organized intent rather than opportunistic behavior. She said it in a way that was clearly intended to be measured and which had the opposite of its intended effect. While the police were doing what they were doing, I did what I probably shouldn't have done, which was try to understand it myself, not by approaching anyone or doing anything physically. I'm not a reckless person, but by trying to think through how someone could know where I was consistently enough that the car park encounter had the quality of something planned, how they'd have my name, what the mechanism was. I thought about my routines, my social media. I had accounts on the usual platforms, used them mildly, not set to private in any deliberate way. I thought about whether I'd made any new contacts recently, online or in person, who I didn't know well enough to trust. I thought about the running route and the coffee shop, and whether I'd shared either of those things anywhere that could be seen by someone I didn't know. And then I thought about the app. About 4 months before August, I downloaded a local community app, one of those neighborhood platforms that had become popular in the area, used for selling things, reporting local issues, organizing community events. I'd registered with my full name and a profile photograph because that's what the sign-up process encouraged, and I hadn't thought about it. The app showed your approximate location when you posted, and I'd posted on it several times, about a planning application near the school, about a lost cat notice someone had asked me to share, a few other minor things, nothing that seemed significant. The app also had a feature I hadn't paid much attention to, a map function that showed members' locations in real time when they were using the app. I'd had location services on. I checked the app settings and saw that the location sharing had been turned on by default, and I'd never turned it off. So anyone on that app could see in real time where I was whenever I had the app open, which was fairly often because it sent notifications I'd been clicking, and I'd posted enough that my profile, with my name and photograph, was visible to anyone who looked. I turned the location sharing off and rang the detective constable and told her what I'd found. What she found, working with a technical specialist over the following weeks, was worse than a stranger on a community app. I'll give you what I understand of it, which is not complete because some of it was never shared with me in full, and some of it I've chosen not to know in full detail. What they established was that my profile on the app had been accessed repeatedly by an account that had been created specifically to access it, an account with a false name and a stock profile photograph, registered with a disposable email address, using the community app for no purpose other than monitoring my location. The account had been checking my profile, and on the days I'd had the app open, my real-time location, multiple times a day for approximately 3 months. 3 months of knowing where I was. 3 months of, occasionally, being where I was. The detective constable told me this with the careful manner of someone who has thought about how to deliver information like this and has landed on directness as the least damaging option. I appreciated that. I sat in her office and she told me about the account and about what they'd been able to trace from it, which connected to a forum. I'd heard about this kind of thing. I wasn't completely ignorant, but hearing about it in the context of your own life, applied to your own name and photograph, makes it concrete in a way that general awareness doesn't. The forum was organized around the targeting of specific individuals, not randomly, deliberately selected, researched, surveilled, documented. The members shared methods, tools, targets. There were threads dedicated to individuals, threads containing photographs taken without knowledge, location data, schedules, personal details assembled through public sources, and through exactly the kind of application vulnerability that had been exploited in my case. The threads were not organized around any obvious motivation that the police could clearly articulate to me. They weren't extortion threads or stalking for hire threads. They appeared to be organized around the activity itself. The accumulation, the watching, the note on the windscreen, just checking in, fit a pattern the forum had documented across multiple targets, a signature almost, a way of letting the person know they'd been seen without revealing anything about who was doing the seeing. I was not the only active target in Scotland. I was not the most extensively documented. That last piece of information was given to me by the detective constable in the same direct manner as the rest of it, and I sat with it for a moment and then asked what it meant for me practically. She said the investigation was active and she couldn't go into detail. She said the threat level to me specifically had been assessed, and I should take reasonable precautions, which she outlined. She gave me a number to ring if anything further happened. The practical precautions are things I now do without thinking about them much, because they become habit. I've tightened every privacy setting on every account I have. I no longer use location services on any application. I vary my running route. I don't sit with my back to a room in the coffee shop anymore. I moved to a corner table the week after the detective constable's office, and I haven't moved back. These things take seconds and cost nothing, and I'm aware that they are also a form of ongoing disruption. A daily reminder that my ordinary life was accessed and used by someone I've never identified. The man in the coffee shop, the grey car at the loch, the note. I think about whether I'm right that these were all the same person, and I think I probably am, but I can't be certain. I think about the note's phrasing, just checking in, and what it was intended to produce in me, whether it was designed to frighten or to demonstrate capability, or simply to make contact, to let me know that the watching was real and that I knew it and they knew I knew it. The detective constable said, when I asked her this, that motivation in these cases was often not what you'd expect, and that trying to understand it from the outside was not always useful. I think about Kirsty. She was on the same community app. I asked her, in a careful way that I hope didn't alarm her, to check her settings, and she did, and she'd had location sharing on as well, and I stayed on the phone with her until she'd turned it off, and then I rang the detective constable and mentioned it, and she noted it. I don't know if Kirsty appeared in any thread. I've chosen not to ask that question directly. Some things you don't want confirmed. The investigation produced an arrest about 4 months after I first made the report. I was told this, and told that there would be a process, and that I'd be kept informed. I've been kept informed, at intervals, in the careful language of ongoing proceedings. I don't know when it will end. I've stopped expecting a clean conclusion. What I've been thinking about instead, and this is the thing I keep returning to, on the drive to work, in the shower, at 2 in the morning when sleep goes again, is the gap. The 3 months between the first thing, the run along the river in August, and the note on the windscreen in October. 3 months of being watched, being photographed, being tracked across a city by someone who was documenting it for an audience I still don't fully understand. 3 months of a life going about its normal business, teaching, running, marking assessments, thinking about nothing particularly important, while someone was watching all of it and filing it carefully away. I don't know what they were looking for. I don't know what I represented to whoever started the thread, what quality or characteristic or piece of simple visibility made me worth that kind of sustained attention. I was just a man going about his days, that's all. That turns out to be enough. The question I keep asking, how long before coincidence stops being coincidence? I now know the answer, or at least my answer, which is the first time. The very first time, the prickling at the back of the neck on the river path in August. That was the answer. The thing that felt like nothing was already something, had already been something for a while before I felt it. And every time I told myself I was imagining things, I was choosing comfort over accuracy. I don't make that choice anymore. That's the thing that has changed most and is permanent. and I'm still working out whether to call it damage or education. Some mornings, running along the river, I still feel it, that specific prickling. I still look around. There's usually nothing there. Dog walkers, the har on the water, the city waking up around me. Usually. The rain lashed against the windscreen, a relentless drumming that mirrored the throb behind my eyes. 39 years old, a failed business, and now this, ferrying anonymous packages through the sodden, forgotten arteries of this provincial city. My worn hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white against the grey plastic. The van, a rental with a persistent rattle in its exhaust, was my office, my prison, my silent confessor. I once owned a small chain of artisan bakeries. Mark's Marvelous Muffins, I'd called it, a name that now tasted like ash in my mouth. The dream had crumbled faster than a stale scone, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a hollow ache where my pride used to be. Compliance, my old friend, had always been my default setting. Nod, agree, avoid the fuss. It was easier, I told myself, than fighting. Now, it was just easier. The private forum, Midnight Runners, had appeared like a mirage in the desert of my despair. A discreet ad, tucked away in a corner of the dark web I'd stumbled upon during a late-night search for anything that paid cash. Courier work, flexible hours, excellent rates, no questions asked. That last part was the hook, the siren song for a man drowning in his own silence. My first few runs were innocuous enough. Small, lightweight boxes, sealed with industrial-grade tape. Drop-offs in dimly lit car parks behind abandoned warehouses. Pickups from anonymous-looking industrial units. The instructions were always precise, a sequence of coordinates and times, delivered via an encrypted message. I was a ghost in the night, a silent cog in a clandestine machine. The money, transferred directly to a burner account, was surprisingly good. Enough to keep the wolves from the door, to make the monthly debt repayments, to buy another week of fleeting normalcy. Then came the wait. The first heavy package felt like a lead brick. It thudded onto the passenger seat, shifting the van's balance. I felt a prickle of unease, a whisper of something cold against my spine. My instructions remained the same. Collect, deliver, do not question. Compliance, Mark. Remember, just do what you're told. The rain had finally eased, leaving the air thick with the smell of damp concrete and exhaust fumes. The streetlights, sporadic and weak, cast long, distorted shadows that danced in my peripheral vision. Tonight's pickup was an old abattoir, long since defunct, its corrugated iron walls rusting like an ancient wound. The air here was heavy, not just with moisture, but with something else, a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. I pulled the van into the designated bay, the tires crunching on gravel. The back door of the abattoir stood ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness against the grey night. No one was visible, just the waiting silence and the rhythmic drip of water from a broken gutter. I clicked off the engine, plunging the cab into near-total blackness. My breath hitched in my throat. This was new. Usually, the package was already waiting, or a shadowy figure would emerge, wordlessly placing it in my van. A low scraping sound echoed from within the building. My heart hammered against my ribs. I swallowed, a dry, uncomfortable gulp. Hello. My voice sounded thin, reedy, swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer. The scraping continued, growing louder, accompanied by a soft, guttural grunt. I fumbled for my phone, the screen a sudden blinding rectangle of light. No signal, of course. A figure emerged from the darkness of the abattoir, silhouetted against the faint ambient glow from the city beyond. Tall, broad-shouldered, its movement slow, deliberate. It carried a large, rectangular object wrapped in heavy-duty black plastic sheeting, secured with what looked like industrial strapping. The plastic gleamed wetly in the faint light. "Evening," the figure rumbled, its voice deep, gravelly, like stones tumbling in a well. No accent I could place. "Here for the pickup?" My throat was still tight. "Yeah, Mark." The figure didn't offer a name. It simply walked towards the van, its gait steady, unhurried. The package it carried was enormous, far larger than anything I'd transported before. It seemed to sway slightly as the figure moved, an unsettling, almost organic motion. "Open up," the figure commanded, nodding towards the rear doors of the van. I scrambled out, my movements clumsy, my hands trembling as I unlocked the back. The figure reached the van and with surprising strength heaved the package inside. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the metal floor. The air inside the van suddenly felt colder, denser. "That's it," the figure said. "Next drop is... you know the drill." I nodded, unable to speak. The figure turned and melted back into the shadows of the abattoir, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence and the hulking presence in the back of my van. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking. The metallic tang in the air was stronger now, a coppery scent that made my stomach clench. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The package, shrouded in black plastic, seemed to absorb what little light seeped into the van. It was too big, too heavy, too cold. The cold. That was the other thing. Some of the parcels, particularly the heavier ones, had started to feel unnervingly cold to the touch, even through the thick cardboard. And then there were the stains. Dark, irregular patches that sometimes seeped through the cardboard, a faint reddish brown. I told myself it was oil, perhaps some industrial lubricant. But the metallic smell. Tonight, the cold was palpable. A frigid aura emanated from the black plastic, chilling the air in the back of the van. My breath plumed in front of my face. My destination was a deserted car park on the far side of the city, nestled between a derelict factory and a stretch of overgrown wasteland. The usual spot. I drove, the van's rattling exhaust a frantic heartbeat against the oppressive silence of the night. Every bump in the road sent a shiver through me, a primal fear that the contents of the package would shift, would reveal themselves. Curiosity. It was a slow, insidious poison, seeping into the cracks of my carefully constructed compliance. Each heavy package, each cold touch, each reddish stain, chipped away at my resolve. Tonight, the dam broke. I pulled into the deserted car park, the only vehicle for miles. The rain had started again, a soft drizzle now, blurring the edges of the distant city lights. I cut the engine, the sudden silence deafening. My hands gripped the wheel, then slowly, deliberately, I released them. "No," I whispered, the word a desperate plea to myself. "Don't do it, Mark." But the word was meaningless. My body moved without my consent. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my movements stiff, robotic. I climbed out of the driver's seat, the cold air biting at my exposed skin. I walked to the back of the van. The rhythmic drip of rain from the roof racked the only sound. My fingers fumbled with the latch, the metal cold and slick. It gave way with a soft click. I swung open the doors. The black plastic package loomed in the darkness, a malevolent presence. The cold hit me then, a bone-deep chill that stole my breath. It was like standing in a freezer. I reached out, my hand hovering just above the plastic. I could feel the intense cold radiating from it. My fingers brushed against the surface, slick with condensation. It wasn't just cold, it was frozen. My gaze fell upon a corner of the package. The plastic, stretched taut, had a small tear, barely an inch long. And through that tear, a glimpse of something pale, something impossibly white. My heart hammered against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Don't do it, Mark. Don't look. But I had to. The need to know, to understand the source of this creeping dread, was an irresistible force. I knelt, my knees protesting against the rough floor of the van. My trembling fingers, cold and clumsy, fumbled at the strapping. It was thick, tightly bound. I tugged, pulled, my nails scraping against the coarse material. Finally, a buckle gave way with a soft snick. I unfastened another, then another. The black plastic, no longer held rigid, sagged slightly. I reached inside the tear, my fingers brushing against something smooth, cold, and strangely yielding. I widened the tear, peeling back a corner of the plastic. The pale object came into full view. It was a foot, a human foot, pale, almost translucent. The toes curled slightly, the nails neatly trimmed, frozen solid. A choked gasp escaped my lips, a raw animal sound. My stomach lurched, a wave of nausea washing over me. I scrambled back, hitting my head on the low ceiling of the van. The coppery smell was overwhelming now, thick and cloying. My eyes darted to the rest of the package, my mind reeling. If that was a foot, then the rest of the package must contain. I didn't need to see more. The image of that pale, frozen foot was seared into my mind. Human remains. I was transporting human remains. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a cry. The horror of it, the sickening reality, crashed down on me. My phone. I needed to call someone. The police. My fingers fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the cheap burner phone I used for the midnight runners' jobs. No signal. Still no signal. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of shock. I had to get out of here. I had to report this. But who would believe me? A down-on-his-luck delivery driver, caught with a body in his van. The evidence was all against me. My eyes scanned the desolate car park. Nothing. Just the drizzle, the distant city hum, and the chilling presence in the back of my van. My mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel. What did I do? Where could I go? The forum. I had to check the forum. There had to be some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my limbs heavy, uncoordinated. I started the engine, the familiar rumble a jarring intrusion into the suffocating silence. I drove, not towards the drop-off, but aimlessly, desperately. The image of the foot, so impossibly white and still, flashed behind my eyelids. I found a small, isolated lay-by, tucked away behind a dense copse of trees. No streetlights, just the inky blackness and the relentless drizzle. I pulled out my personal phone, the one I kept for real life. Miraculously, there was a weak signal. My fingers flew across the keyboard, navigating to the private forum. My heart pounded with a terrible premonition. I typed in my credentials, the screen flickering to life. My eyes scanned the recent posts, looking for anything, any clue, and then I saw it. A new thread, posted just minutes ago. The title, stark and chilling, stood out like a freshly dug grave. A driver available, reliable, discreet. Beneath it, a photograph. A grainy, low-resolution image of my van. My rental van. And then the details. My name, Mark, my phone number, my address. My world tilted. The air left my lungs in a ragged gasp. They knew everything. They had been watching me. This wasn't some random job. It was a trap. I wasn't just a courier. I was a mark. The horror of the foot in the back of my van was instantly eclipsed by a new, more visceral terror. They knew where I lived. They knew who I was. And they were advertising me. Not as a driver, but as a commodity. A new piece of inventory. My own compliance, my lifelong habits of doing what I was told, had led me here. To this desolate lay-by, with a frozen body in my van, and my own face plastered across a forum for what? The rain hammered against the roof of the van, a frantic drumbeat accompanying the frantic hammering of my heart. I was trapped. There was no escape. They had me. My phone rang, a sudden jarring sound that made me jump. The number was unknown. My hand trembled as I answered. Mark, a deep voice rumbled, the same voice from the abattoir. No question, just a statement. You've been a good boy. My breath hitched. What? What do you want? A low chuckle, devoid of humor. We want you to continue being a good boy, Mark. That package in your van, it needs to be delivered to the usual spot. And then you come home. Home? I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. You know where I live? We know everything, Mark, the voice purred. And we know you're a man who understands consequences. You've seen what happens when people don't comply, haven't you? The image of the frozen foot flashed before my eyes. My stomach churned, a bitter bile rising in my throat. Yes, I managed, the word tasting like ash. I understand. Good, the voice said, a note of satisfaction in its tone. Now, deliver the package, and then we'll talk about your next assignment. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, the screen dark, reflecting my own terrified face. My reflection, pale and drawn, stared back at me, a stranger in a nightmare. I was no longer just a delivery driver. I was an accomplice, a silent partner in a gruesome enterprise. And my compliance, my fatal flaw, had finally devoured me whole. I restarted the van, my hands clammy on the wheel. The cold from the back of the van seeped into the cab, a constant chilling reminder of my new reality. The rain continued to fall, washing over the city, washing over me, but it couldn't wash away the stain of knowing, the stain of complicity. I drove towards the drop-off point, the deserted car park. The silence in the van was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken horror of what I carried and the chilling certainty of what awaited me. My life, once a mundane struggle against debt, had twisted into a grotesque dance with death, orchestrated by unseen hands. And I, compliant Mark, was now one of their puppets. My strings, once invisible, were now pulled taut, binding me to their macabre game. The night stretched before me, endless and terrifying, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I would never be able to unsee what I had seen, or undo what I had done. The weight of it all, heavier than any package I had ever carried, settled deep within my soul, and I drove on, into the inescapable maw of my own making. The familiar coordinates glowed on the GPS, a cold, digital beacon in the gloom. The car park, a desolate expanse of cracked tarmac, stretched out before me, illuminated by the intermittent flicker of a broken streetlight. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the van's engine and the distant wail of a siren, a mournful cry swallowed by the vastness of the night. I pulled up to the designated spot, a faded painted bay near a chain-link fence. My hands, still trembling, cut the engine. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I stared at the dashboard, unable to move, unable to breathe. The cold from the back of the van was a physical presence, wrapping around me, seeping into my bones. My eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. The black plastic package, still menacingly large, seemed to pulse in the faint light. The torn corner, a gaping wound, showed just enough of that ghastly white foot to keep the image fresh, vivid, horrifying. A flicker of movement caught my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows near the derelict factory. It moved with a fluid, almost predatory grace. My breath hitched. This wasn't the usual anonymous drop-off. This was different. The figure approached the van, tall and lean, its face obscured by the deep hood of a dark jacket. No, not a jacket. A heavy coat, long and flowing. The figure stopped a few feet from the rear of the van, its stance relaxed, almost casual. "Evening, Mark." A voice, smooth and cultured, floated through the damp air. It was different from the gravelly voice on the phone, yet equally chilling. Right on time. I swallowed, my throat dry. "The package." "Yes, the package," the figure mused, stepping closer. I could feel its gaze, sharp and assessing, even though I couldn't see its eyes. "A rather substantial delivery tonight, wouldn't you say?" My silence was my answer. "Open up, Mark," the figure instructed, a subtle gesture of its gloved hand towards the back of the van. My fingers, numb with cold and fear, fumbled with the latch. It clicked open, a sound like a pistol shot in the stillness. I swung the doors wide. The black plastic, with its horrifying contents, was fully revealed. The figure stepped forward, pausing at the threshold of the van, its head tilted slightly. A long, slender hand, encased in a black leather glove, reached out. It brushed the torn plastic just above the frozen foot. "Ah, yes," the figure murmured, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on its lips. "You found our little surprise, didn't you?" My blood ran cold. You knew." "Of course we knew," the figure replied, its voice laced with a predatory amusement. "We wanted to see if you were truly compliant, Mark. If you truly understood the nature of our work." It glanced at me, and even though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt their piercing intensity. "And you did. You delivered it." A wave of shame, hot and sickening, washed over me. I had complied. I had delivered a body. I had become one of them. What now?" I asked, the words barely a whisper. The figure stepped into the van, moving with an unnatural ease around the massive package. It produced a small silver device from its coat pocket, a scanner. It ran the device over the package. A soft beep confirmed the delivery. "Now, Mark," the figure said, turning back to me, "you go home. And you wait for your next instructions." "My next instructions," I stammered. "But the forum. My details. You posted them. For what?" The figure chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Oh, that. A little insurance policy. Just in case you decided to deviate from the plan. To ensure your continued discretion." It paused, its gaze unwavering. "You're a valuable asset, Mark. Reliable, discreet, just like the post says." My mind reeled. They weren't going to kill me. Not yet. They were keeping me as a driver, a silent participant in their monstrous trade. The post wasn't a warning. It was an advertisement. For me. "But the body," I whispered, my voice thick with horror. "What do you do with them?" The figure tilted its head again. "That, Mark, is not your concern. Your concern is to drive. to deliver, to remain discreet. It took another step closer, its presence overwhelming. Do you understand? I nodded, unable to do anything else. My compliance, once a shield, was now a chain. Good, the figure said, its voice softening, yet somehow becoming even more menacing. Now, leave the package and go home. It stepped out of the van, melting back into the shadows. I heard a faint click, then the distinct sound of a heavy door closing. I peered into the darkness. The figure was gone. The package remained, a silent, chilling testament to my new reality. I closed the van doors, the metal clanging shut with a finality that echoed in my soul. I climbed back into the driver's seat, my hands still shaking, my mind a maelstrom of fear and despair. I drove home, the journey a blur of rain-slicked roads and flashing streetlights. The van, now empty of its gruesome cargo, felt even colder, filled with the lingering chill of death. My small terraced house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I parked the van, switched off the engine, and sat there in the darkness, listening to the rain. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the frantic beat of my own heart. I stumbled inside, the familiar surroundings offering no comfort. The scent of stale coffee and old papers filled the air, a stark contrast to the metallic tang that still clung to my clothes, to my skin, to my very being. I stripped off my clothes, throwing them into a corner as if they were contaminated. I stood under the shower, letting the hot water sluice over me, scrubbing my skin raw, trying to wash away the stench of the abattoir, the cold of the freezer, the indelible stain of the frozen foot. But it wouldn't wash off. It was inside me now. I crawled into bed, the sheets cool against my burning skin. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the pale, frozen foot, the pristine white nails, the curled toes, and then my own face, superimposed over the image, a grim, silent accomplice. The next morning, the sun, a weak, watery disk, struggled to penetrate the grey clouds. My phone buzzed. A new encrypted message. My heart leaped into my throat. New assignment. Pick-up point. Old textile mill, East End. Time, 2200. Package, standard. Payment, increased, standard. That meant smaller. But the payment increase, it was a bribe. A subtle reinforcement of the chain. I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the delete button. I could run, disappear, but where would I go? They knew everything. My name, my address, my face. They had advertised me. They owned me. My compliance, once a quiet habit, had become a monstrous, all-consuming force. It had led me down a path from which there was no return. I was no longer Mark, the failed baker, the struggling delivery driver. I was Mark, the reliable, discreet courier, the one who asked no questions, the one who delivered. The thought of the money, the increased payment, gnawed at me. It would clear a bigger chunk of debt, buy me more time, more normalcy, a fleeting illusion of control. I pushed myself out of bed, my limbs heavy, my mind numb. The metallic tang was still there, a phantom scent. I walked to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I made a cup of tea, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the storm of my despair. As I stirred the sugar, my eyes caught my reflection in the dark surface of the tea. A man, hollow-eyed and gaunt, stared back, a stranger. The old Mark, the one who tried to maintain a facade of control, was gone, replaced by this new Mark, a puppet dancing to a macabre tune. I lifted the cup to my lips, the warm liquid a bitter comfort. The night awaited, and I, the compliant Mark, would be there, driving, delivering, lost in the labyrinth of my own making, forever stained by the cold touch of what I carried. The rain had stopped, but the chill remained, and the hum of the van waiting outside was a constant haunting reminder of my inescapable fate. I was a ghost in the night, a silent cog in a clandestine machine. Only now I knew what the machine processed, and I was part of it. I'm not sure why I'm writing this down. Maybe because saying it out loud to anyone feels impossible, or maybe because I need to see it all laid out in front of me, to understand what actually happened. Either way, I keep thinking that if I don't tell someone, even if it's just words on a screen, then I'm going to lose my mind trying to make sense of it alone. This started about 14 months ago, during a particularly bleak period in my life. I was living in Leeds, working as a pharmacy assistant, which sounds more important than it actually was. Mostly, I just counted tablets and dealt with people collecting prescriptions. The pay was terrible. I'd recently ended a long-term relationship, and I was spending most of my free time alone in my bedsit feeling sorry for myself. Not a great place to be mentally, but not unusual either. Plenty of people go through rough patches. One evening, after a particularly tedious shift, where the automated system had gone down and we'd had to process everything manually, I came home and did what I usually did. Made some toast, opened my laptop, and started browsing mindlessly. I'd been reading about internet privacy, data collection, that sort of thing. The kind of articles that make you realize how much of your personal information is floating around out there. It's unsettling when you really think about it. That led me down a rabbit hole about anonymity online, which eventually led to articles about the dark web. I'd heard of it, obviously. Everyone has. But I'd always assumed it was either inaccessible to ordinary people or exclusively used for illegal purposes. The articles I read suggested otherwise. Apparently, a lot of it was just people wanting privacy. Activists in repressive countries, journalists protecting their sources, whistleblowers. Normal people who didn't want corporations tracking their every click. Getting access turned out to be surprisingly straightforward. I'm not particularly technical, but I managed it in maybe 15 minutes. And suddenly, there I was, browsing this entirely different version of the internet. Most of it was disappointing, honestly. Broken links, sites that wouldn't load, pages that looked like they'd been designed in 1995. I spent an hour clicking around, not finding anything particularly interesting or shocking. Then I found something called the Volunteer Program. It was linked from one of those directory sites that list various dark web services. The description was minimal. Connect with people who need help. Make a real difference. There was a simple web address underneath. When I clicked through, the page that loaded was plain but professional looking. White background, black text, a logo at the top showing two hands clasped together. The homepage explained what the program was about. Essentially, it was a platform connecting volunteers with people who needed assistance but couldn't access traditional help channels. People in difficult situations. People who couldn't go to authorities or official organizations for various reasons. The site emphasized that everything was confidential and anonymous, designed to protect both volunteers and the people seeking help. It all sounded quite noble, actually. There was a section explaining the kinds of help people might need. Someone to talk to during a crisis, assistance locating resources, help navigating difficult personal situations, support for people escaping dangerous circumstances. The site stressed that volunteers were never asked to do anything illegal or put themselves at risk. It was purely about offering guidance, emotional support, and practical advice to people who had nowhere else to turn. There was a button at the bottom, register as a volunteer. I clicked it without thinking too much about it. The form that appeared asked for basic information: age, general location, languages spoken, areas where I might be able to help. There were options to select: emotional support, practical advice, resource guidance, local knowledge. I ticked a few boxes. Emotional support seemed doable. I could listen to people. And local knowledge, since I'd lived in Leeds for several years and knew the area reasonably well. The form asked for an anonymous contact method. I created a temporary email address and submitted the form. The confirmation page said someone would review my application and be in touch within a few days if I was accepted. I closed the browser and didn't think much more about it. It had been a momentary impulse, filling out a form on a random website. I didn't really expect anything to come of it. 4 days later, I checked the temporary email account and found a message waiting. The subject line said, "Volunteer application approved." The message welcomed me to the program and explained how it worked. When someone needed help, they would submit a request through the platform describing their situation. The system would match them with appropriate volunteers based on location and expertise. If I was selected for a request, I'd receive an email with details and could choose whether to accept or decline. Everything was anonymous. I'd never know the real identity of the person I was helping, and they'd never know mine. It seemed straightforward enough. At the end of the email was a link to the volunteer dashboard where I could view any requests assigned to me. I clicked through. The dashboard was empty except for a welcome message and some basic statistics. Apparently, there were around 300 active volunteers and roughly twice that many people seeking help at any given time. The site had been running for several years and had facilitated thousands of successful connections. I left it at that. Checked the dashboard every few days, but there were never any requests assigned to me. I started to forget about it. Then, about 3 weeks after I'd registered, an email arrived. The subject line said, "New request assigned, action required." The message explained that someone in the Leeds area had submitted a request for help, and I'd been matched based on my location and indicated areas of support. The person's situation was described briefly. They were trying to leave a difficult living arrangement, but didn't have access to traditional support services. They needed advice about local resources and someone to talk to who understood the area. There was a link to a secure messaging system where I could communicate with them if I chose to accept the request. The email stressed that I could decline at any time, for any reason, with no explanation required. I clicked through to the messaging system. There was one message waiting, sent from an anonymous account identified only as Request 247. The message was longer than I'd expected. It explained that the person was living with a family member who had become increasingly controlling and aggressive. They wanted to move out, but didn't have much money or anywhere to go. They couldn't go to the council or social services because of complicated family circumstances they didn't want to explain. They just needed someone to talk to who knew Leeds, who might be able to suggest places to stay or organizations that could help without asking too many questions. The tone was desperate, but not melodramatic. Just someone in a bad situation, looking for practical help. I wrote back, said I was sorry they were going through this and that I'd try to help however I could. I asked a few questions about what kind of accommodation they were looking for and whether they had any income. Basic things that would help me point them in the right direction. The response came within a few hours. They answered my questions, provided more details about their situation. They couldn't afford much rent. They needed somewhere short-term, just until they could get themselves sorted. They'd been looking at rooms in shared houses, but most required deposits they didn't have. Over the next few days, we exchanged several messages. I suggested a few hostels and shelters I knew about. Gave them information about local charities that help people in housing crises. I looked up details about housing benefit and how to apply. I tried to be helpful without being pushy or overwhelming. They seemed grateful. Said I was the first person who'd actually listened and tried to help, rather than just telling them what they should do. That felt good, honestly. I was going through my own rough time, feeling fairly useless, and here was something I could actually do that made a difference. After about a week of messages back and forth, they said they'd found a room. Someone was letting them stay temporarily while they sorted out something more permanent. They thanked me repeatedly, said they couldn't have managed without the information I provided. I felt genuinely pleased. It was a small thing really, just answering some questions and pointing someone toward resources, but it had helped. They were safe, or safer at least, and I'd played a small part in that. The messaging system showed the request as completed. A few days later, I received an email from the volunteer program thanking me for my assistance and asking if I'd be willing to accept future requests. I said yes. The second request came about 2 weeks later. Different person, different situation. Someone who was being harassed by an ex-partner and didn't want to involve the police. They needed advice about staying safe, about what to do if the harassment escalated. I provided what information I could, suggested some local organizations that specialized in domestic abuse support, even though they insisted it hadn't reached that level yet. That one resolved fairly quickly too. They said the harassment had stopped after they'd followed some of the safety advice I'd given them. The third request arrived a month after that. This time, it was someone who needed help finding a specific type of support service in Leeds, something to do with mental health. Though they were vague about the details, I did some research, found a few options, passed the information along. They seemed satisfied. I started to feel like I was actually good at this, like I'd found something worthwhile to do with my evenings beyond sitting alone, feeling miserable. The requests kept coming. Maybe one every couple of weeks. All different situations, all different people, but all following roughly the same pattern. Someone in trouble, needing local knowledge or a sympathetic ear, and me providing what help I could. Then I got a request that felt different from the start. The initial message was brief and oddly formal. It said the person needed help with what they called a sensitive observation matter. They needed someone in Leeds to visit a specific location and report back on what they saw. Nothing illegal, they stressed. They just needed an independent observer to confirm some information for them. I wrote back asking for more details. What location? What kind of information? The response came quickly. They provided an address in Headingley, not far from where I lived, a residential street. They said they needed someone to go to that address at a specific time, observe the property for maybe half an hour, and report back on any activity they saw. Were the lights on? Were there cars in the driveway? Did anyone come or go? I asked why they needed this information. The response was vague. They said they were trying to verify someone's living situation for personal reasons, but couldn't visit the location themselves. They assured me it wasn't anything sinister, just a matter of confirming some details. It felt odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe it was someone checking up on a property they owned, or trying to find out if a relative was actually living where they claimed to be. There were plenty of innocent explanations. I agreed to do it. The address was only a 10-minute walk from my flat. I could go one evening after work, spend half an hour sitting on a bench or walking around the area, see what I saw, and report back. Simple enough. I went the following evening, around 7 o'clock. The address was a terraced house on a quiet street. Lights were on inside. There was a car in the driveway, a dark blue Vauxhall. I walked past a few times casually, like I was just someone out for an evening stroll. The curtains were drawn, but I could see movement through them occasionally. Someone was definitely home. After about 40 minutes, I left and went home. Sent a message through the system describing what I'd seen. Lights on, car present, signs of occupancy. The response came within minutes. They thanked me and asked if I'd be willing to do the same thing again in a few days, at a different time. They wanted to establish a pattern. That's when I should have said no. But I didn't. I'd already done it once, and nothing bad had happened. It was just observation, just reporting factual information. So I agreed. I went back 3 more times over the following week. Different times of day, morning, afternoon, evening. Each time I sent back a brief report. Car present or not present. Lights on or off. People coming or going. Basic observations. After the 4th visit, they said they had everything they needed and thanked me for my help. The request was marked as completed. The next request came a week later. Different person, but similar task. Another address, this time in Kirkstall. Same basic assignment, observe and report. I did it without questioning. Then another request, another address, another observation. I started to realize that most of my requests now were these observation tasks. The other kind, the ones where people needed emotional support or practical advice, had mostly stopped coming. Now it was almost exclusively these surveillance requests. I should have stopped accepting them, but by that point, I'd done maybe 10 or 12 of them, and nothing bad had ever come of it. Nobody had ever confronted me. The police had never shown up. As far as I could tell, I was just collecting information that could have been gathered by anyone walking down a public street. Then I got a request that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The address they gave me was on my own street, 4 doors down from my building. The message said they needed the usual information: observation of the property, activity reports, times when people were present or absent. But it was so close to where I lived. I walked past that house every day. The person making the request would have known that when they assigned it to me. They would have known my general location from my volunteer profile. I wrote back asking why they needed this information. The response was the same vague explanation I'd received before. Personal verification, nothing illegal, just needed an independent observer. I almost declined, but I'd accepted so many of these requests already. What was one more? And it was on my own street. I didn't even need to go out of my way. So I did it. Watched the house for a few days, sent back my reports. The request was completed without incident, but something about it stayed with me. Made me think about all the other observations I'd done, all those addresses, all those reports about when people were home and when they weren't, about their routines and patterns. I went back through my message history, counted up all the observation requests I'd completed. There were more than 20 different addresses across Leeds, 20 different properties I'd surveilled and reported on. I started wondering what the information was being used for. Personal verification, they'd always said. But verification of what? And why did it require multiple observations at different times? Why did it need to be done anonymously through a dark web platform, rather than through any official channel? I tried to tell myself it was fine, that I was overthinking it, that there were legitimate reasons someone might need this kind of information. But the unease wouldn't go away. I stopped accepting observation requests. When they came through, I declined them without explanation. For a while, that seemed to work. I'd get the occasional request, decline it, and nothing would happen. Then I started noticing things, small things at first. My post seemed to arrive later than usual, like someone was checking it before it reached my door. I'd find my bin moved slightly, as though someone had been looking through it. Once, I came home to find my front door unlocked, even though I was certain I'd locked it that morning. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of everything was getting to me, that there were innocent explanations for all of it. Then I checked my volunteer dashboard and saw something that made my blood run cold. My profile had been updated. There was a new section I'd never seen before. Services provided. It listed all the observation requests I'd completed. But not just the addresses. It included photographs of the houses I'd watched, of the streets, of the cars in driveways, of people entering and leaving properties. I hadn't taken any photographs. I'd just observed and reported. But someone else had. Someone had been following me, documenting my surveillance work, taking pictures while I stood there watching houses. And those photographs were now attached to my profile, visible to anyone using the platform. I tried to delete my account. The option wasn't available anymore. I sent a message to the platform administrators demanding they remove my profile. No response came. I stopped checking the dashboard, stopped looking at the messages, but the emails kept coming. New requests being assigned, observation tasks, all in Leeds, all near my home. Then the photographs started appearing in my post, printed out and slipped into my letterbox. Pictures of me standing on various streets, watching various houses. Pictures I hadn't known were being taken. Each one had a date and timestamp. Each one showed me doing exactly what I'd been asked to do. There was never a note with them. Never any explanation, just the photographs. I went to the police, told them someone was following me, taking pictures of me. They asked if I knew who it was or why. I said no. I couldn't tell them about the volunteer program or the observation requests. How could I explain that without implicating myself in something that sounded, in hindsight, very much like stalking? They said they'd keep a record of my report, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I be vigilant, maybe install a camera outside my flat. I couldn't afford a camera. I could barely afford rent. The photographs kept coming, sometimes 2 or 3 a week. Always pictures of me doing observation work. Always stamped with dates and times that proved exactly when and where I'd been. Then one arrived that was different. It showed me walking home from work, not doing any observation task, just walking down my usual route. The date stamp was from the previous day. They were still following me, still documenting my movements, even though I'd stopped accepting requests. I checked the dashboard one more time. My profile now listed me as temporarily unavailable, but still showed all the completed requests, all the photographs. And there was a new section, current location tracking. Underneath was a map, showing my movements over the past few weeks, my route to work, the shops I visited, the pub where I occasionally met friends, all of it plotted out in detail. I don't know how they were tracking me. My phone, probably. Or maybe they were just following me physically. Maybe it was both. I moved out of my bedsit 2 weeks later, found a new place in a different part of Leeds, didn't tell anyone where I was going except my employer, changed my phone number, deleted all my email accounts, and started fresh. For a few months, everything seemed fine. No more photographs. No more strange incidents. I started to relax, to think maybe I'd managed to escape it. Then a new request appeared. I don't know how it found me, because I deleted everything, but somehow it did. An email to my new address from the volunteer program. Subject line: outstanding request, urgent. The message said I had one final observation task to complete. An address in my new neighborhood, a property 3 streets away from where I now lived. They'd found me again. I haven't accepted the request, but I haven't declined it either. It just sits there in my inbox, waiting. And every few days another email arrives. A reminder that the request is still pending, that I'm expected to complete it. I don't know what happens if I refuse. I don't know if they'll escalate, if more photographs will arrive, if they'll do something worse. I've started seeing the same people around my new neighborhood, different people than before, but they're always there, standing on corners, sitting in parked cars, looking at their phones. Maybe they're just ordinary people going about their business. Maybe I'm paranoid now, seeing threats everywhere. Or maybe they're volunteers too. Maybe the whole thing works like this. You help them with one thing, then another, until you've helped so much that you can't stop, until they have so much information about you, so many photographs, so much documentation of your activities, that refusing becomes impossible. I don't go out much anymore. Work and back, that's it. I keep my curtains drawn. I check my post immediately when it arrives. I've covered the camera on my laptop with tape. The request is still sitting in my inbox, still waiting. And I know that eventually I'm going to have to make a decision. Accept it and hope that completing one more task will finally be enough. Or refuse it and find out what they do to volunteers who stop cooperating. Either way, I don't think this ends well for me. I was stupid, naive. I thought I was helping people. I thought I was doing something good. But I wasn't helping anyone. I was working for them, gathering intelligence, conducting surveillance, and now I'm trapped in it with no clear way out. So that's why I'm writing this down. Because if something happens to me, if I disappear or if something worse occurs, at least there will be some record of how it started. Some explanation of why a pharmacy assistant from Leeds ended up involved in whatever this actually is. I wanted to help people. That's all it was supposed to be. But I've learned something these past few months. When someone offers you the chance to help anonymously, with no questions asked and no accountability, you should ask yourself who's really being helped. And more importantly, who's being used.